Chapter 1253. This was a tractor. Among the 10 or so people, most of the Yuanying were barely able to fly. There were also a few burdens. More than half of the driving force of the formation came from the newly joined true monarchs. This made the Yuanying extremely grateful. This was also the reason why Lu Xui chose them. If you chose a group of true monarchs, who would be grateful to you, they would only find you troublesome. Their intentions were unclear. He didn't ask why they had no choice. There was only one kind of happiness, but there were countless kinds of sadness. In the cultivation world, you have to learn to tolerate it and treat these possible injustices as the normal rhythm of cultivation. Ever since a cultivator stepped into the cultivation world, it was a process of fighting against the heavens and people. There was no fairness. Because he was dragging a group of people, his speed was greatly affected. He estimated that he would be delayed for at least 1 or 2 years. But compared to his goal, it was worth it. While he was always on guard against possible dangers, the dangers were nowhere to be seen. Their group was just like countless people chosen by the heavens. They yearned for the beauty of the origin world and were driven by various backgrounds to embark on this journey with an unknown future. These people were actually the mainstream of the cultivators of the Heaven's Choice continent. They didn't care about which origin world they were attacking. This was because they knew that they were cannon fodder. Even if they survived, they would be in a disadvantageous position in the future distribution of benefits. He was very quiet. This was because he had to familiarize himself with the true monarch stage. The group behind him was also very quiet. He didn't know the reason, but silence was beneficial to everyone. Lu Xiaoyi didn't need to make up a story. These Yuanying also didn't need to find a reason for their departure. Everyone had their own place. In the blink of an eye, 5 years had passed. The gravitational force had obviously decreased. Even the weakest Yuanying could fly on their own. Lu Xiaoyi stopped dragging them. Both sides understood that it was time to separate. This was a tacit understanding. But the result of the decrease in gravitational force, other than being able to fly more freely, there was also trouble. Because here, the battles between cultivators were basically unaffected. This was also the place where the internal members of the Heaven's Choice settled their disputes. The group of Yuanying that Lu Xiaoyi was helping were obviously in a similar situation. Someone was waiting for them. There were 3 monks, 1 Buddha, and 2 bodhisattvas. They quietly hovered in the void, but they only looked at Lu Xiaoyi in surprise. Obviously, they did not expect that there would be a perfected cultivator among this group of people. This was not within their control. Was it a chance encounter? Or was it the mastermind behind the scenes? It was hard to tell. The leader of the Yuanying group, Hude, transmitted his divine sense to him. "Master, this is our problem. It has nothing to do with you. I will explain it to them. Thank you for your help along the way. If you don't die, I will repay you in the future." Lu Xiaoyi sighed. "Do you think they will believe you if you tell them now?" It was too late. At the very least, he would definitely be accused of being an accomplice. He might even be accused of being the instigator. Let's continue watching. There's no need to explain. Hude was a little embarrassed. "Master, our actions in Heaven's Choice are a little unbearable." Lu Xiaoyi didn't care. Everyone has their weaknesses. No one is more noble than anyone else. If I can help you, I will. If I can't, I will leave. You guys have to be smart. He was never a good person. In these few years, he had met several groups of cultivators. The reason why he helped this group was because he felt that they never left each other. People with this kind of quality, how bad could they be? There were countless filthy things in the cultivation world, but they were all just on the surface. Even he, Lu Xui, was not a good person in the eyes of the people of Heaven's Choice. G Country's Dragon Tree greets fellow Taoist. I wonder which country fellow Taoist is in? Where do you sit on the tablet? G Country, one of the 36 high countries. It had the Nirvana Tao tablet, and it was also a country where Buddhism flourished. Lu Xiaoyi had been in Heaven's Choice for more than 10 years, and he rarely met any Buddhists. All of them were extremely low-key. Who would have thought that he would bump into them when he was about to leave? This was fate. The attitude of Buddhists was actually what he cared about the most. However, with his yuanying cultivation, he was unable to focus on this. Sitting on the tablet was asking about one's origin. It was not the same as asking which country one came from. The flow of talents of Heaven's Choice cultivators was more casual, especially when they reached the level of monarch. Of course, they couldn't only pass through one Tao realm. They had to go around seeking Tao. Where to sit on the tablet was asking which country he was seeking Tao in. Which country fellow Taoist was asking about his true origin. Of course, there was a possibility that there was, and there was a possibility that there wasn't. He wasn't sure. Rogue cultivators, nameless people, don't mention it! Lu Xiao played dumb. It was hard to say who he was. If he told them the truth, he might bring unnecessary trouble to those nascent soul stage cultivators, such as colluding with the main world. It was meaningless to make up an identity, so he might as well refuse. However, refusing to reveal his identity would be seen as a guilty conscience in the eyes of others. The Dragon Tree Buddha didn't pester him. 5 years ago, the Ji country's lonesome pagoda forest was robbed. Countless Buddhist treasures and relics in the forest were emptied. It was the most serious blasphemy incident in Ji country for thousands of years. We have sufficient reason to suspect that this incident is related to you, so we stopped you. As long as you can prove that there are no Buddhist treasures in your storage rings, you can leave. However, if you can't, the Buddha above will not allow anyone to be presumptuous in the land of Buddha. Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. It turned out that he actually helped a group of tomb robbers. Tomb robbers? They were really bold to dare to come and touch the treasured shrines of the ancestors of the monks. He didn't know how they did it with their weak strength. In the cultivation world, it was actually the same as in the mortal world. There were also countless obscure and unpopular organizations, such as this kind of organization that wanted to touch the places where people's ancestors were worshipped. The so-called treasure hunting of the cultivators was actually a kind of tomb robbing behavior. The only difference was whether there was an owner or not. If there was no owner, then it was an opportunity. If there was an owner, then it was tomb robbing, blasphemy, and provocation. Robbing the tomb of a Buddhist country's pagoda forest was indeed not a good reputation. In the cultivation world, everyone despised it. This was the most basic common sense that every cultivator should abide by. As for him, he couldn't ignore this kind of behavior just because he was dragging his feet all the way. However, Buddha was very straightforward. Since they were stopped, there was nothing to say. Although there were only 3 monks in front of them, they weren't opponents that they could deal with. The 2 bodhisattvas were great perfection guardian monks. Not to mention, there was also a Buddha at the level of supreme. If they were to fight, they had no chance of winning. Therefore, he waved his hand. More than 10 yuanying took out their storage rings and released the restriction inside. Obviously, they had already expected this and had a countermeasure. The Dragon Tree Buddha didn't say anything, but the 2 bodhisattvas went forward to check carefully. Not only did they check the storage rings, they also checked the bodies of these yuanying. This was somewhat rude and treated them like criminals. However, the yuanying didn't resist. Obviously, they were already mentally prepared for this. They found nothing. Chapter 1254. Actually, the Dragon Tree Buddha had already confirmed whether there were any Buddha items on them the moment he stopped these people. The aura of the ancestors' relics couldn't be hidden from his senses. It was just a necessary procedure. It not only showed his righteousness, but also provoked the resistance of the tomb robbers. It was a good opportunity to get rid of them. Unfortunately, the tomb robbers were very calm and didn't give him a reason to act. He was very sure that the business in Silent Pagoda Forest was done by this group of people. It was mainly due to their own carelessness. In the cultivation world, some things didn't need real evidence. They could be found after a search. But here, it was a little different. The appearance of a monarch changed half of the simple pursuit. He was very hesitant. Were those relics and Buddha treasures hidden on this Taoist monarch? Or did someone else carry them and take a different route? A cunning rabbit has 3 burrows. Using a large group to attract the attention of the pursuers and sending a trusted subordinate to carry the treasures wasn't a rare thing in the cultivation world. He couldn't really let this group of people go. At least, he had to get the information of the other route from their mouths. So he looked at Lu Xi. They all faced it calmly. How can you teach me? He was asking how Lu Xi could prove his innocence. Lu Xi sighed. This was the helplessness of the cultivation world. When you really didn't want to cause more trouble, trouble wouldn't give you a chance to get rid of it. Of course, he couldn't be as obedient as those Yuanying. This was a matter of principle. Otherwise, his 1,000 years of sword cultivation would be wasted. And even if he could prove his innocence, this monk would still find other reasons to make things difficult for them until he achieved his goal. Actually, he didn't have many choices to respond. Before he opened his mouth, Huda choked. Master Dragon Uncle, this master is just a stranger to us. He helped us when he saw that we were having a hard time. He carried us all the way. Until now, we don't even know this master's name. Don't you accuse him of something else? Then he turned to Lu Xiaoyi and bowed deeply. Master, I'm sorry for the trouble. But the grudge between us and the Ji country needs to be explained so that the master can judge. The reason why the Buddhists in the Ji country think that we are the culprits is because we have a grudge against each other, so we are the most suspicious. I'm not going to waste my breath. We're just a small sect. Because we couldn't hold our ground in the Ji country, we were chased out by the Buddhists. So, the Buddhists thought that we had a grudge against them and were waiting for a chance to take revenge. Therefore, everything has its origin. We are not the tomb robbers that everybody in the cultivation world hates. What Huda said was a lot of information. In fact, the reason behind it was not clear. It took a slap to make a sound, and a fly would not bite a seamless egg. At the very least, one bullied others with power, while the other dug up your ancestral roots. Each had their own ruthlessness. However, these small forces could only flee in panic after being ruthless. This was the fate of the weak. Uncle Long thought he was just talking nonsense. He looked at Lu Xi. His meaning was clear. How can you prove that you have nothing to do with this? Lu Xiaoyu really couldn't prove it. At the very least, it was impossible for him to accept the method of proof. I've cultivated for 1,000 years, but I've never been searched before. Why does the Ji country's Buddhists want to set a precedent here? Long Shu refused to budge. Everything has a beginning. Our Ji country's Buddhists are not unreasonable. If you want to blame someone, blame yourself for getting involved with these people. You're traveling alone. Do we have to find trouble with you, a perfected monarch? Lu Xue spread his hands. Then there's nothing to talk about. I have to continue traveling. The old rules of the cultivation world. If you can stop me, then stop me. If you can't, then go back and ask for help. He was too lazy to say anything more. He turned and left. This was actually giving Hu De and the rest a chance. If these people still didn't know how to take the chance to escape, then they really couldn't be saved. He left without hesitation. How could the 3 monks let him go? With the dragon tree in front and the 2 bodhisattvas behind, they blocked Lu Xiaoyi's path. The Buddha of the dragon tree came out of its body and shook its light of Buddha. Suddenly, a path of Buddha appeared on Lu Xiaoyi's path, as if it led to the other side. This was a very novel Buddhist method. It was different from the Buddha country. There was no Vajradharma, but it fully expressed the true meaning of Buddhism. It was Long Shu's best skill, Nirvana Buddha aura. If one continued to walk until the end of the path, then the person would also reach the end. They would either submit to Buddhism or die. However, there wasn't a trace of smoke or fire. It was as if the cultivator's life was integrated into this Buddhist path. It was really a brilliant application of the Nirvana Tao. The beginning of the path was the beginning of life. The end of the path was the end of life. As for the application of the Tao state, the 2 bodhisattvas behind him were full of praises. Draconic Tree's Nirvana light was famous even in the Ji country. Even the great Buddha of the Sun God was full of praises for it. In fact, it was the most suitable method at the moment. It not only gave the Taoist a chance to turn back, but also clearly informed him of the consequences of being stubborn. It wasn't that they were afraid of killing, but they still wanted to know the specific whereabouts of the Buddhist treasures from him. G country's Buddhism placed great importance on chasing down this group of tomb robbers. Therefore, although they only sent 3 of them, in terms of strength, the 2 of them were actually enough to wipe out this small force that didn't know when to advance or retreat. This wasn't arrogance, but because they knew each other very well after interacting with each other for a long time. Now that Marshal Uncle Long Shu was in charge, there was even less to worry. They were both guardian monks who had dealt with all kinds of disputes outside for a long time. They were very experienced in facing enemies. In fact, they knew very well that the best strategy now was to let Long Shu deal with this strange Taoist alone. The 2 of them should focus on the 10 Yuanying to prevent them from escaping. However, it was also because of their rich battle experience that they noticed that this Taoist was different from the others. It was a feeling of extreme danger that they rarely encountered in their lives. Because the 2 of them were also existences who could fight against ordinary perfected lords alone, but now, even they felt danger from this Taoist. This was actually just because Lu Xiaoyi had just become a perfected lord and couldn't perfectly conceal his aura. A swordsman who could make others feel danger wasn't a good swordsman. The best swordsman should be the kind that even the enemy would feel like they were bathing in the spring breeze. It was because they felt the danger from this Taoist that the 2 bodhisattvas followed far behind their martial uncle. In their opinion, with the strength of these tomb robbers, even if they let them go for a period of time, they wouldn't be able to escape. The key was that this perfected lord was the key to solving the problem. In their eyes, Marshal Uncle Long Shu stood at the head of the path of nirvana and the Buddha's light, while the Taoist ran on the path of Buddha as if he didn't feel anything. It formed a beautiful picture as if a Taoist was running into the arms of Buddha. It was very meaningful. This was the true Buddhist Dharma. Chapter 1255. Lu Xiaoyi ran amidst the Buddha's light with a look of enjoyment and contentment on his face. It was as if he did not know that his final destination was in the depths of the Buddha's path. He ran and ran like an idiot. But the more he ran, the more surprised the dragon tree who was standing at the end of the path. Because he realized that this guy seemed to have almost run out of the Buddha's path, but he did not seem to have done so. It was a very strange feeling. The path to the Nirvana realm was only a relative term. In reality, whether it was Lu Xiaoyi who was running wildly, the dragon tree who was not in a hurry, or the 2 bodhisattvas who were far behind, they were all moving at lightning speed. Running out of the Buddha's path was just a feeling. In fact, the Buddha's path itself was a feeling, and it did not refer to the actual path. The dragon tree Buddha's Dharma did not take much time. He did not really need to run to the end of the world. In his feeling, once you ran to the end of the path, that was the end. It was a very Buddha-minded thing. It was precisely because of this that Lu Xi did not actually treat this thing as the Buddha's path. He did not approve of it, so the Buddha's path was useless to him. It was easy to say, but it was very difficult to do it. He could do it because he had the Great Way of Merit, and because he had a basic understanding of the Great Way of Nirvana. This was the reason why the more profound the Tao and Buddha's Dharma was, the easier it was to be broken by others. If you threw a knife over, the physical appearance would be there. No matter how you deal with it, you would eventually have to deal with it. However, this kind of mysterious contest of the Tao state was different. It seemed like there was no way to deal with it at all. The so-called mystery, once deciphered, was useless. This was also the reason why Xianyuan swordsman would definitely release the flying sword no matter how high his realm was, or how strong his understanding of the Tao state was. You can say 1,000 things about how mysterious it is, but I have a sword that is practical and convenient. It may seem vulgar and ordinary, but you can't just ignore it. Therefore, he did not treat this kind of Buddhist secret art as the Buddha's path at all. In his eyes, this was a void, and he was just running. This was not in line with the swordsman's tradition of daring to draw their swords. The reason for this was to give the Yuanying more time to escape. With his simple-minded attitude, it wasn't easy for him to drag a group of primary school students across the road, but in the blink of an eye, he cleaned up all the primary school students. Then what was the point of doing good deeds? Yi Heng's charity was too complicated, too contradictory, and too hypocritical. His charity was very simple and direct. Once he did a good deed, he would publicize it loudly. Therefore, he distanced himself a little and dragged on for a little longer. This was the last thing he could do for these fellows who were either seeking revenge or grave robbers. He was not confident that he could quickly finish off the 3 monks, especially the Dragon Tree Buddha. He could sense that this was probably a middle-ranking Buddha on par with a Taoist essence soul perfected lord. In theory, he was still one level below him. Therefore, he could drag on for time and secretly observe this person's foundation and methods before he drew his sword. This was the best way to deal with the current situation. A perfected lord's life was 3,000 years of Yin spirit, 4,000 years of primordial spirit, and 5,000 years of Yang spirit. He had only entered the realm for 5 years, so he still had 2,000 years to ponder over his perfected lord's swordsmanship. It was too arrogant to say that he could instantly kill a primordial spirit perfected lord. The dragon tree finally felt that something was wrong. He realized that he had underestimated this Yin spirit Taoist in front of him. To be able to escape his Buddha's path without anyone noticing, even he did not know what method he used, this Tao state ability was not ordinary. He felt that the Buddha's path did not work. Of course, he could not continue to do useless things. Therefore, he retracted his Buddha's power and the mighty Buddha's light. He was about to try other methods. Just as he was retracting his Buddha's path, he felt that the retracted Buddha's path was 2 times stronger than normal. He knew that something was wrong. His Buddha's power retracted, and he destroyed the realm. It was also at this moment that a sharp edge penetrated his body and erupted, tearing his entire Buddha's body into countless pieces. This was what the 2 bodhisattvas behind saw. They saw the entire process clearly, but they were also confused. They knew that someone had taken advantage of the opportunity to attack their martial uncle when he was retracting his Buddha's path, but they did not know how it was done. They vaguely felt that it was a flying sword, but they could not be sure. A flying sword. They knew that they were in big trouble. They did not dare to leave, because the Taoist's gaze swept over them. His intent was awe-inspiring. Even their martial uncle could not withstand the power of this person's sword, not to mention the 2 bodhisattvas. The only thing that could save them now was whether or not this person would attack the younger generation. In the void of the universe, there was no difference between the upper and lower realms. Everyone treated everyone equally, regardless of their realm. However, there were some ancient orthodoxies that still abided by their ancient traditions and did not attack those of lower realms. Such orthodoxies were rare, especially in the era of the collapse of the Great Tao. However, if there were any, the proud orthodoxy of the sword vein would definitely be among them. This was their only chance of survival. The Taoist shrugged. Your master is not dead. He just died once. So, do you still want to search my body to prove my innocence? The 2 bodhisattvas smiled bitterly. They had no choice but to bow under the eaves. Even if they were proud and did not back down when facing a Taoist perfected monarch, there were still people in this world who were prouder than them. It was not embarrassing to bow down to a perfected monarch of the sword vein. This was a common understanding among Buddhists. We have eyes but failed to recognize the spirited mountain. Since you are an expert of the sword vein, you will not participate in such filthy matters. Actually, if you had revealed your identity earlier, my martial uncle would have known that this was just a coincidence the moment you drew your sword. Lu Xiai smiled. Since you know about the sword vein, you should know the swordsman's way of doing things. If he did not kill, why would he draw his sword? As for me, first of all, I wanted to help those little Yuanying. I have killed countless people in my life and have not done many good deeds. Now that I have done a good deed, you should let them spread it around for me? Otherwise, wouldn't I have done it for nothing? Moreover, your family's adults are quite capable and have made my heart itch. So, I will let you follow me for a while to give those little Yuanying a chance to escape. You will fulfill my wish, right? His words were all true, but the two bodhisattvas broke out in cold sweat after hearing it. This was the most standard swordsman. The most simple reason. It couldn't be any more straightforward. To be able to speak of shamelessness in such an open manner, to be able to speak of bloodthirstiness in such a matter-of-fact manner, there seemed to be no other swordsman in this world. The worst thing was that they were very clear that there was no such tyrannical swordsman in the Heaven's Choice continent. Although there were some people who were imitating swordsmen, they could not emulate the charm of a real swordsman. He was not a swordsman of the Heaven's Choice continent, and he was wandering around the Heaven's Choice continent as if he was taking a stroll in front of his own home. Then, thinking about how the Heaven's Choice cultivators had been preventing certain orthodoxies from getting close to a certain domain for the past few hundred years, this person's roots were on the verge of being revealed. It was not that they were afraid of the enemy, but in the Heaven's Choice continent, who was not afraid of this orthodoxy? So be it if they followed. On the bright side, this orthodoxy was the most trustworthy. They did not have to worry about their lives, Buddha blessed them. Chapter 1256. The three of them walked one after the other. Lu Xiaoyi did not force them, but the two bodhisattvas did not dare to have the slightest disloyalty. They knew very well that nothing would happen if they were obedient, but if they dared to do anything, they would regret it. Do you think I'm bullying the weak, ignoring the concept of right and wrong, and condoning tomb robbing? Lu Xiaoyi joked. It seemed that he had not fully adapted to his role, and had not yet cultivated the aura of an elder in front of Yuanying. The two bodhisattvas did not want to answer, but they did not dare not to. Was there a need to answer such a simple question? I think you have your considerations, but in the world of cultivation, such behavior violates the bottom line. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. Everyone's considerations are from their own point of view. I've lived for more than 1,000 years, but I've never seen the so-called thinking from another's point of view. Thinking from one's own point of view, that's what a person is. He looked at the two. He was not born to like preaching, but he was very wary of Buddhism. This came from his judgment of the general trend of the universe. In terms of the realm, there was the possibility of Heaven's Choice, Zhou Xian, or other powerful realms stirring up trouble, but in the context of the universe, the chaos of several realms was really nothing. In his opinion, the competition between orthodoxies was more dangerous than the war between realms. That was the true nature of the universe, and no one was spared. And in the orthodoxies, one could never bypass the hurdle of Buddhism. The sword vein, ancient beasts, and innate spiritual treasures were certainly threats, but because of the size of each, and the future of the new era, they could only change the situation a little. Specifically, in terms of Tao, there might only be one or two changes, such as the sword Tao tablet. When all kinds of threats were exaggerated to the extreme, it was as if everyone's eyes were on a certain sword lunatic from 10,000 years ago, on the body vein that had always been unwilling to give up, on the path of faith that was ready to stir, and on the innate spiritual treasures that had always stood aloof from worldly affairs. However, he had forgotten that the most likely event in the future would be a simple challenge between number 2 and number 2. That was the essence of it. However, this eternal number 2 seemed to be especially quiet before the big change. It was as if they were already used to this position, and didn't want to make any changes. Was it because there was no hope for the number 1 position, or was it because the number 2 position was very stable? Lu Xiaoyi didn't think so. However, his trip to the Heaven's Choice continent this time around was limited by his cultivation level and the fact that he had more important upper realm requirements. He had basically gained nothing from coming into contact with the Heaven's Choice Buddhist sect. But the next time he came here, he wouldn't do this again. Therefore, he chatted with these little monks, not because he really wanted to learn something from them, because they themselves might not know anything. He just wanted to use them as a catalyst, a way to pull out a thread. It might be useful, but it might not be useful. Since flying was lonely and he had nothing to do, he wouldn't feel tired even if he chatted a bit more. Your hatred comes from the theft of the pagoda forest of the ancestors. Their anger came from the oppression of the living space. To you, the solitary country doesn't tolerate any orthodoxies other than the Tao of Nirvana. To them, why should their ancestral land be occupied by others? In this way, it finally came to the conflict between Taoism and Buddhism. After that, it came to the creation of heaven and earth. Was it the chicken that laid the egg, or the egg that laid the chicken? There's no end to this, and there'll never be a reason. So, why do you have to put on such a righteous and indignant attitude? This is the cultivation world. Respect the strong, respect the strength. Your strength is stronger than theirs, so they have to run away. My strength is stronger than yours, so you can only give up. Isn't it simple? The two bodhisattvas shook their heads as they listened. This was pure swordsman logic. Lu Xiaoyi said meaningfully. Don't carry too much. You won't be able to carry it. Your ancestors are dead, so why do you have to draw a circle and trap yourselves? One of the bodhisattvas was very dissatisfied. Senior! You make it sound so easy. So it's not against your orthodoxy. If it's really your turn, you might not be much stronger than us. Lu Xiaoyi sneered. My orthodoxy? So what? Let's not talk about others. Even the one with the greatest achievements made me unhappy this time. I'll still scold him. He didn't even dare to leave a grave. If he did, I'll definitely take a dump on his grave to vent my anger. He wasn't exaggerating when he said this. But in the ears of the two bodhisattvas, their hearts were beating like drums, and they kept quiet out of fear. These sword lunatics were really unreasonable. They even scolded the supreme sword immortal of their orthodoxy. It seemed that a little grievance here was really nothing. They couldn't even respond to his words. With their hundreds of years of life experience, their opponents dared to scold their own ancestors, but they, as enemies, didn't dare to do so. Where did this come from? The two bodhisattvas were in a dilemma when the lunatic in front of them suddenly waved his hand. The time is up. You can leave now. Feeling a sharp attack coming at them, the two bodhisattvas were frightened and desperately retreated, but they couldn't get rid of it. They could only retreat again and again until they were very far away. Only then did they realize that the so-called sharpness was actually nothing. They knew that this was the lunatic's way of forcing them to leave. They couldn't help but feel scared. This was before he even drew his sword. If he really drew his sword, they probably wouldn't even be able to retreat. When they looked forward, there was no trace of the lunatic. Lu Xiaoyi was running. This time, it was a real escape. It was a run for their lives, and not some so-called strategic retreat. Because he could feel that the extremely unfriendly aura was directed at him. It was the Sun God Supreme. How could there be hostility from the Sun God Supreme? He didn't know. Moreover, he didn't think that even the dragon tree that came back to life after being destroyed had the ability to mobilize the Taoist Sun God. Buddhism and Taoism were incompatible, and there was still a gap between them. How could it be? Then, who was looking for trouble with him for no reason? This didn't look like a premeditated attack, but more like an accidental accident, because the Sun God's unscrupulous divine sense swept out, and because there was an obvious target in his divine sense. In the blink of an eye, he couldn't make a judgment, so he could only run first. After he bragged to the two bodhisattvas about respecting the strong and respecting the fist, the way of heaven immediately put his words into practice. It was just that before, it was him who showed his fist to others, but now it was others who showed their fist to him. He never regarded such a battle as his glory. He didn't want to use such a battle to prove anything. Maybe in the future, but definitely not now. The appearance of the Sun God was too sudden, so sudden that by the time he reacted, he had already lost the best window of teleportation. Teleportation was the best way to escape, but the premise was that he couldn't let the divine sense of a cultivator whose realm was too much higher than his. Otherwise, a disaster might happen, a disaster that he couldn't even completely control. Instead of being trampled on in the changing space, he would rather escape under normal circumstances. At the very least, he could still draw his sword freely. Chapter 1257. The distance between the two of them was rapidly closing. In the void of the universe, the distance between two cultivators was determined by the discovery of their divine senses, the locking of their divine senses, the attack range, and the line of sight. Because of the difference in realm, when he discovered the sun god, the other party had already locked onto him with his divine senses. This meant that when he used teleportation, it was possible to interfere with or even defeat his teleportation. The key was that his mastery of the Tao of space was still very limited. Therefore, he couldn't counterattack. In terms of attack range, he couldn't make the first move. Even though his flying sword was famous for its long-range attack, there was still a gap between him and an experienced Yang spirit with his new Yin spirit ability. Therefore, when the other party could beat him up, his short hands couldn't reach the other party. He was helpless, but this was the gap between them. If the sun god was determined to beat him up, he really couldn't do anything. Of course, because the distance was too far, the sun god's attack might not be able to exert its full power. There was no communication. When Lu Shi beat up the monk, he was still in the mood to talk, but when he was inexplicably beaten up by others, he was more used to not saying a word. This was his last pride. The Yang spirit really did make a move outside his attack range. There was no special secret skill. In fact, at the stage of the Yang spirit, the skill was close to the Tao. Those so-called fancy moves had long been abandoned. He was more willing to directly use the strength of the evolution of the Tao realm to fight, instead of taking risks and using unconventional moves. It was just a punch, but the force came from afar, and the changes in the Tao realm were amazing. The great way of destruction. Lu Shi could only defend, and this was not his will. The flying sword left his body and split into nearly 1,000,000 rays. This was also another great improvement in the sword light division after he became a supreme. But who would have thought that the first time he used it, his opponent would be a sun god? The long river of flying swords collided with the opponent's fist force as it moved forward. The collision of strength was secondary, but the collision of the Tao realm was more important. What should he use to deal with the great way of destruction? The standard answer was that any innate great way would do. As long as one's comprehension of the great way was no less than that of the sun god, this answer was meaningless. In terms of targeting, Tai Chi, creation, and nirvana were all extremely targeted and could achieve twice the result with half the effort. Unfortunately, he was not proficient in any of them. He could also use the slaughtered Tao realm to fight back, but Lu Xiaoyi's most experienced death gaze couldn't be used because he couldn't see anyone. Thus, such a silly collision was already disadvantageous to him. His choice was actually very simple. He chose one of his 6 Tao realms, because only these 6 Tao realms could resist the destruction of the Yang spirit. Others had been immersed in the Tao realm for thousands of years, while he had only been in it for a few hundred years or even a few decades. Yet he was unable to use the Tao realm that he was not familiar with to deal with it. He had chosen to become a Hellguard. An Anitya Hellguard, coupled with a first glimpse into the arts of destruction. This was also the difference between his Tao realm ability and others. When he was in the nascent soul formation stage, he had gained a basic understanding of the 36 great Taos. This allowed his Tao realm combination to produce many variations. He could find his own way to deal with any Tao realm attack. The opponent crushed over with destruction. He used the Anitya Hellguard to combine with his shallow knowledge of destruction, focusing on changing the nature of destruction. In the end, he reduced the opponent's suffocating destructive power to a level that he could withstand. This was the essence of defense. It was not something that could be solved by setting up a shield. This was Xiaoxiu's understanding of defense. At the level of supreme, defense was given a whole new meaning. Not to mention a shield, even building a house for oneself would be meaningless. In fact, It was only a moment. The collision of the Tao realm could take years in the evolution of heaven and earth, but in a battle, how could it be so slow? There was no basic collision. It was just a sudden touch in a certain aspect that could kill. It was clear at a glance whether one was standing or lying down. However, the Yang spirit felt that this swordsman's opponent was a little difficult to deal with. His destruction Tao realm was unstoppable, but after passing through the opponent's sword river defense, it was fundamentally changed by some inexplicable force. As a result, when it hit the opponent, it was just a small injury that didn't hurt at all. Interesting. It was the way of a Nitya Hellguard. Furthermore, this person also had a shallow understanding of the great Tao of destruction. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to change his destructive power in such a short time. He didn't have any psychological burden when the Yang spirit attacked the Yin spirit. None of the cultivators guarding the outer space of Heaven's Choice would have such a feeling. This was because the sword vein orthodoxy from the outer space had never cared about it. In the eyes of these lunatics, killing Jin Dan when they were at Foundation Establishment, killing Yuanying when they were at Jin Dan, and killing Supremes when they were at Yuanying. Of course, they should kill half-immortals when they were at Supremes. Since the other party was so confident, why should they bind themselves? This time, he was a little unlucky to be in charge of the outer space of Heaven's Choice. He encountered a sword vein orthodoxy that made people pale at the mention of it in the universe. A primordial soul-perfected lord had been causing trouble outside Heaven's Choice for decades, causing people to be exhausted. What happened now? Not only did the primordial soul-perfected lord ignore him, but even the Yin spirit-perfected lord of this orthodoxy came to make his presence known. If this could be tolerated, what else could he do? He didn't succeed in the Tao of destruction, but it didn't matter. He knew a lot of Tao realms, so how could this Yin spirit new be compared to him? This time, he didn't swing his fists. Instead, he formed a black and white cosmic tornado in the opponent's space. This was the materialization of the Tao of Yin and Yang. Under the twisting of Yin and Yang, cultivators with insufficient Tao realms wouldn't be able to control themselves. In the end, they would be swept away by the Yin and Yang and lose themselves. When Lu Xiaoyi saw the black and white tornado, he immediately understood that this was the foundation of Yin and Yang. He didn't know much about Yin and Yang and was still in the initial state when he was at nascent soul. Although he didn't understand Yin and Yang, he understood the 5 elements. And the 2 innate Taoists of Yin and Yang and the 5 elements were inextricably linked. The sword river rolled up, containing his understanding of the 3 Tao realms, 5 elements, impermanence, and Yin and Yang. 2 proficient and 1 elementary, but together, they still had the ability to defend. His goal was still not to have a perfect defense. Instead, he wanted to use the 5 elements as the foundation based on his initial understanding of the Tao of Yin and Yang. With the impermanence transformations as the foundation, he wanted to convert the mysterious Yin and Yang energy into the 5 elements, and then break them one by one. The combination of the Tao realms finally played an important role in his foundation of 6 Tao realms. And the most important part of his defense was the impermanence transformations, which played an extremely important role. And so on. In the future, if he used the impermanence Tao realm to complement the other Tao realms, then there would be no Tao realms that could truly threaten him. They might be able to harm him due to the difference in Tao realms, but such harm would always be limited and wouldn't result in any substantial results. Of the 36 innate Taoists, none of them were useless. The impermanence transformations that he spent so much effort to understand began to play an irreplaceable role in battle. Chapter 1258. The Yang God Supreme Ishur was a little surprised. It was unbelievable that a Yin God Supreme could compete with him in the Tao realm. Why did he want to beat him outside the range of the swordsman? It was because he was wary of the incredible swordsmanship of the sword vein. He was not worried about his life, but he did not want to lose face. It was not enough to kill the Yang God only in the present life, but also in the past life and the future life. In other words, only by killing 3 lives together could one truly kill a Yang God. This was almost impossible for a yin god. For example, the one in front of him might not even have the ability to see through his past life, so how could he pose a threat to him? However, as a yang god, face was also incomparably important. Even if he was killed in the present life, he could not tolerate it. Therefore, hanging outside the range of the swordsman was a very safe distance. Using the Tao realm to suppress him, he could not only play with the other party, but also did not have to worry about the swordsman jumping over the wall. However, after 2 futile attempts, he could not put it down. A yang god who had lived for 4,000 years could not win in a pure contest of Tao realm. If this got out, he would be laughed at. Of course, he had to get back his face from where he lost it. The yang god Ishur unhurriedly displayed his thousands of years of accumulation of Tao realm. He did not believe that with his 4,000 years of learning, he could not deal with a 1,000-year-old yin god. A 1,000-year-old yin god had only been in contact with Tao realm for a few hundred years. How could he have the time to learn so much? Interception of luck, holy virtue, space, thunder, origin, cause and effect. At the level of yang spirit, the icy grand sage's understanding of the Tao realm had always been extensive. This was recognized by all the high-level cultivators of the heaven's choice. There was plenty of time, so he took it out one by one and let this junior enjoy it. He knew that the sword vein was not the only one in the world. Lu Xiaoyi had been running at full speed, even though his movements could not escape the Yang God Supreme's eyes. His goal was not to get rid of the Yang God, but to find a place to borrow strength. There was no future if he continued fighting like this. Sooner or later, he would be exhausted to death. He had to find a position where he could attack, even if the time was very short. In his current situation, no matter what method he used, it would be very difficult for him to get close to the Sun Spirit. The huge gap between their realms made him lose his advantage in speed. No matter how fast the cheetah was, it was still a joke in the eyes of Old Eagle. Therefore, he had to borrow strength. There were very few places in the negative space that he could borrow strength from, because this place was too spacious, and there were very few stars and meteorites. And the direction he was moving in had always been within his plan, a lone meteorite. In the negative space, any celestial bodies that were close to the Heaven's Choice continent would be sucked into the continent's framework by the powerful attraction force. Of course, it was impossible for meteorites to appear, and there weren't even any celestial bodies. Therefore, for this thing to exist here, there was only one possibility: man-made factors. This was a reverse space beacon. That was why it could exist. His goal was a little too obvious, but there was no better way. This was because he could not find a second celestial body that he could borrow other than this meteorite. It was still too close to the Heaven's Choice. The plan was very thorough. At least, that was what Lu Xiaoyi thought. He had done his best. After cultivating for 1,000 years, this was the first time he had been forced to the end of his rope. However, since it was the Sun Spirit, it wasn't too shameful. The Yang Spirit's Tao realm had changed 7 times since the beginning of the attack, and he was able to defend himself every time. There were many reasons for this. The combination of his Tao realm had shown great resilience, which was the most important. Of course, it was also because the Yang Spirit was too far away and couldn't fully display the wonders of the Tao realm. Even so, almost every Tao realm attack had caused him considerable damage. This was the difference in strength, and also the characteristic of the impermanence Great Tao. It could change anything and defend against anything, but it couldn't completely defend against it. There was always some Tao realm power that leaked out, and he couldn't defend against it, so he was beaten badly. This kind of Tao realm battle didn't seem to be as bloody and cruel as real swords and spears, but under the appearance of an almost deductive method, life and death could only be more dangerous in an instant. It was also more in line with the fighting style of top cultivators. The 8th Tao realm change that the Yang Spirit displayed was the Karma Great Tao. This had completely broken away from the category of causing substantial physical damage to cultivators. It was more of a mystery in the unseen world. If it couldn't be resolved, it would disrupt the karma of a cultivator's life and cause the normal karma order of a cultivator to be disrupted. This would lead to a series of far-reaching retribution laws that wouldn't be immediately manifested. It would communicate with fate in the unseen world, allowing a small cause to become a big effect, or a big cause to have no effect. The retribution of good and evil followed like a shadow. The karma of 3 lifetimes would never be lost. When all of this was messed up, the guide to a cultivator's behavior would have no basis. Evil without retribution, good without fruit, would have a subversive impact on a cultivator's future cultivation. If one couldn't get out of it, there would be no way to talk about the Tao path. Lu Shui didn't use his sword, and this wasn't something that could be solved by using his sword. The karma duel between the two was more like a discussion of the Tao. The loser would lose the most important karma system of a cultivator, and the karma threads would be entangled in a mess. He didn't have any good ideas. Among the 6 Tao that he was proficient in, there was no one that he could directly deal with. Therefore, he still used the old method, which was to use fate as the main, impermanence to supplement it, and karma as the foundation. In order for the Tao of karma to play its role, it had to be through fate. His method was to let nature take its course, turn the other party's karma invasion into fate with impermanence, and then use his own deep fate foundation to fight against it. This was also the application that he had gradually become familiar with in this battle. From this point of view, this Yang Spirit's Tao State attack was like a Tao State sharpening stone, serving as the best training partner for his Tao State growth. However, this training partner was a little fierce. If he didn't deal with it well, he might lose his life. This time, the Tao State contest took a long time. Because there was no real physical attack or defense, it was like 2 dead people flying in the void. The relative distance was the same, but there was no other movement. They were close to the meteorite mark and the conditions for Lu Xiaoyi to launch a counterattack. The only thing he didn't know now was which main Tao state of this strange Yang spirit was. This would determine the decisive direction of this person's attack. But he had no time to verify it. As a swordsman, he had to first consider his own counterattack. The key to counterattack was to bring the opponent into the sword range, and what he had to do was to do this through his body movements and psychological judgment. It was a little difficult, and he wasn't completely confident, but it was worth a try. In the karma duel, Lu Xiaoyi came to the meteorite mark and took out an item. It was the space treasure that the old Taoist Taiga had given him in the Changshuo region, the 3 points Xian. After using it, he didn't return it to Lao Jun Temple. It wasn't that he wanted to take it, but that Taiga hadn't returned after being sent away. Taiga had repeatedly asked him to return it to him. So it had always been in his hand. Chapter 1259. 3-point Xian could create an independent space. Of course, whether or not it could avoid the perception of the other party's Yang God depended on the level of their spatial Tao realm. No matter what, this was indeed a spatial treasure. Lu Xiaoyi's spatial ability was only at the entry level, but now that he had become a monarch and used this thing again, with the bonus of the treasure, it was worth looking forward to whether or not he could contend against the Yang God. The activation of the 3-point Xian had no support in the void of the universe. It was extremely easy for opponents with spatial Tao realm to destroy it. Therefore, he had to find a star to cover it. There were no stars here, only meteorites. In the application of the spatial Tao realm, it was very important to have such a physical barrier. The key was that Lu Xiaoyi did not immediately use the 3-point hyacinth. He had only activated it and placed it here as a backup. Therefore, he needed a meteorite. This was the consequence of not having enough understanding of spatial Tao realm. He could not do as he pleased. He put down the 3-point Xian and drew a sky, especially when there was a road sign hidden in the meteorite beside him. This was what he had done in the Changshuo realm. He had once sent a large number of void beasts. Now, he was very familiar with doing it. It was also his chance to turn the tables. The time had come, he no longer hesitated. He did not care that the spatial passage drawn by the 3-point Xian behind him had begun to take shape. With a flash of his body, he had already disappeared from his original spot. The next moment, he had already entered the range of the Yang God's flying sword. This was the enhanced version of teleportation. It was a comprehensive application of swordsmanship and spatial teleportation. The advantage was that it was farther than teleportation, and it also had an extremely short stiffening time. As soon as he appeared, the flying sword shot out, heading straight for the Yang God who was still out of his sight. But his efforts were destined to be in vain. This time, he did not enter the area where he could not escape. It was like a missile that had been locked on and fired. If the other party turned around, he could still fly out of the missile's range. As soon as he approached, EC immediately sensed it and had expected it. He was just curious why the swordsman had only started to fight to the death now. He smiled and even had the time to dust his sleeves. He deliberately waited for the flying sword to attack before he leaped back. The Yang spirit's ability to escape was no small matter. It was not something that Lu Xiaoyi could compare with. His body moved with the space, and his figure was like a shadow. With just this jump, he immediately escaped out of the range of the flying sword. It was not that he thought that he was really in danger, but that he was completely confident that he could solve the problem from a distance. Then, why did he give the swordsman a stage? These hateful Xianyuan sword cultivators' favorite method was to force their opponents to the point where they couldn't even use their trump cards. Today, he was going to give them a taste of their own medicine. This was also a psychological battle of wits and courage. Lu Xiaoyi was not surprised at all. How could he approach a Yang spirit in such a simple way? It was not swordsman the flying sword Xian, the flying Xian, the swordsman, the Xian, this time, it was a super long-distance sword Xian. He relied on the flying sword that he had buried near the meteorite to measure himself back. Then, he plunged headfirst into the already prepared 3-minute profound space. EC's reaction was very fast, but before he could react, there were two variables that he could not ignore. One was the space passage that the opponent had secretly set up behind the meteorite. Of course, such a small action could not be hidden from his perception. In fact, from the moment the Yin God cut open the space, he knew it in his heart. Of course, Lu Shi did not know which EC's main Tao realm was, because his main Tao realm was actually the space Tao realm. This was a trap. He had been beating the swordsman and deliberately distancing himself. In fact, he wanted the swordsman to lose his patience and then use the space Tao realm to leave or approach. Then, when the swordsman used the space Tao realm, he would use the space ability that he was best at to deal with him. Now it seemed that the first approach was to force him to distance himself, and then return to enter the space passage to leave. It was also a very good tactic. He was sure that because the swordsman had been running all this time, the final escape was also in line with his personality. Another variable was that, in his perception, another sharp aura was rapidly approaching him. This aura was so familiar, because he had been fighting with this lunatic in this space for dozens of years. He was different from the Yin God swordsman in front of him. This one was the real Yang God swordsman, an existence like him. To him, he had suffered a lot from this fellow all these years. He was very clear about the difference in strength between them. Perhaps the difference in their cultivation level was not big, but if they really fought, he would definitely not be a match for him. After dozens of years of encirclement, they, the heaven's chosen cultivators, were unable to do anything to this Xianyuan swordsman. This was a fact. Now, after beating the young one, the old one must be coming for revenge. In an instant, Ishur made a decision. He had to prioritize things. This was the basic quality of a great cultivator. Otherwise, if he did not prioritize things, there would be endless trouble in the future. Chapter 1260. P.S. First of all, thank you to Milky Way Alliance Orange Fruit 2021 for your support. To be honest, it is the author's fortune to have such readers. I can't thank you enough. But this old man started to update crazily before the spring festival, and now he is at the end of his rope. Let's take a break. Old Joy smoked a cigarette and took a deep breath. This feels like being hollowed out. Lu Xiaoyi traveled through the space tunnel, prepared to fight to the death. He had just become a monarch, and he was about to die, but that did not make him feel much emotional. He had been waiting for this day for a long time, but he did not expect it to be like this. He vaguely knew that to kill the sun god, he had to kill its 3 lives. But he was a little confused as to how to kill it. Then in this fight, if he could not kill its 3 lives, would he be able to kill its present life? That was what he wanted to know the most. He had only cultivated for 1,000 years, and he had already promoted his opponent to the sun god. Was this ability to attract hatred innate? Let's do it! He could see that in this life, he could no longer be as low-key and reliable as a normal cultivator. He wanted to be a rice worm, but he became a pest. He wanted to be a spell cultivator, but he became a swordsman. He finally knew what kind of mentality those so-called trendsetters in history had. That was when thousands of people were watching the tide of Qiantang. Some unlucky person fell into the sea, and then he became the trendsetter in everyone's hearts. Get a hammer! It was all for the sake of his dog life. There was light in front of the tunnel. Although it was his first time entering the space tunnel, and there were many places he was not familiar with, at least he knew that this was the end. It was time to see the results. The flying sword rushed out and stopped in front of him. This was the advantage of using the space tunnel. It was not like teleportation, where there would be a short moment of distraction. The position he had set was the position of the sun god. Of course, it was impossible to coincide with hundreds of thousands of miles of space, but there was still hope for him to be included in the flying sword's range. In the life of a swordsman, this was often helplessness. Other than fighting with your life, what else could you do? The swamp of peace was filled with poisonous fog, poisonous insects, and countless traps. This was not a place where mortals or beasts could enter. Even beasts with lower cultivation levels did not dare to approach. However, this was nothing to the gifted immemorial beasts. In the center of the swamp, there was a square building that was several hundred feet tall, built with beasts' bones. To humans, it was very crude, but to demonic beasts, it was the most suitable altar in their hearts. This was the Northern Territory, the northernmost piece of land in the Heavenly Grace mainland. Although it was called the Northern Territory, it actually occupied close to 30% of the Heavenly Choice mainland's surface area. On one hand, it was because of the terrifying strength of the masters here. On the other hand, it was also a principle of the relationship between humans and taiga beasts. If the place was big enough, they shouldn't come out to stir up trouble in the human world. Otherwise, when the humans turned out in full force, even immemorial beasts would be wiped out. This was the world of the ancient beasts. Beside the altar of peace, big and small, fat and skinny, beautiful and ugly, flying and crawling, thousands of ancient beasts were gathered together, staring at the altar as if they were waiting for something. In the history of the Heavenly Choice mainland, this was the place where the ancient beasts would worship. However, most of the time, only half-immortal level ancient beasts could participate in the worship. Then, a few hundred years ago, all the half-immortal old ancestors were captured and sent to an unspeakable place. Now, it was these true monarch-level taiga beasts' turn to make the decision. To the ancient beasts, there was no such thing as yin spirit, yuan spirit, or yang spirit. They were not separated as clearly as humans, and only had a rough understanding of the realms. For example, there were a few hundred true monarch-level beasts and thousands of yuanying beasts standing here, but they would only call each other senior monarch or junior monarch. There was a reason for this. Only demonic beasts with ancient bloodlines could be called monarchs. Those with mixed bloodlines that were not noble enough could not be called monarchs, no matter what realm they were in. Actually, the so-called mixed bloodlines were just the product of these ancient beasts being bored and energetic during their daily lives with other ordinary beasts. After millions of years, their bloodlines had long been mixed together, so how could it be clear? However, those who participated in the worship had to have pure bloodlines, and could not be careless. Because they were worshipping the ancestors of the ancient beasts. Previously, it was half-immortal ancient beasts worshipping immortal beasts. Now, it was normal ancient beasts worshipping half-immortal beasts. To the ancient beasts, the people they worshipped were also divided into different levels, and could not be surpassed. Worship was a type of religious activity, and originated from the belief of harmony between heaven and earth. Religion was also divided into the belief of heaven and earth, and the belief of their ancestors. Humans would place more emphasis on the belief of heaven and earth. As for the demonic beasts, they did not think so much. Of course, they would place more emphasis on the belief of their ancestors. The two words worship focused on reporting to the ancestors and heaven and earth. Worship focused on hoping that the ancestors of heaven and earth would give them new guidance, teachings, and inspiration for their future work. In the upper half of the worship, the left side was a beast, the right side was a hand, and below was God. In worship, the left side was God, and the right side was sea. There was an inherent difference. Compared to today's worship in the swamp of peace, the main purpose was to worship. They wanted to ask their half-immortal ancestors about the future development of their clan, the changes in the trend, and the direction of their actions. Under the collapse of the Great Tao, even the usually calm and intelligent humans could not remain calm, not to mention them who were born with heaven and earth. They were even more uncertain. In the new era, as long as it was an intelligent creature, they would consider their position and future in the future world. This was inevitable. Did they need to leave Heaven's Choice Continent? Did they need to join hands with Heaven's Choice Continent to attack the origin world? If they did not leave and stayed in the empty Heaven's Choice Continent, where would the future of the ancient beasts be? Following the crowd was not only an old problem of humans, it was also an old problem of demonic beasts. When the people beside you raised their heads to look at the sky, if you did not look, you would feel that you would lose something. Even if there was nothing in the sky, only a few pieces of bird poop. Actually, a few hundred years ago, when those half-immortal ancestors left, which one of them did not give advice to the younger generation in the clan? But advice was one thing, it could not go against the changes in the environment. Seeing the Great Tao collapsing one after another, it would be nonsense to say that they were not anxious. What was worse were those human neighbors. They were restless. All kinds of preparations, countless connections, and the visit of the great world of the origin world, as well as the rarely seen Heaven's Choice cultivators starting to fortify the outer space of Heaven's Choice Continent to prevent unrelated spies from sneaking in, all of this showed what it meant. Although after millions of years, humans and primordial beasts never saw eye to eye with each other. Humans despised the primordial beasts for being crude and barbaric, while the primordial beasts despised humans for being cunning and treacherous. But privately, the primordial beasts were still convinced by the intelligence of humans. Humans were the rulers of the immortal court. Even so, many humans had started to raise their heads to look at the sky, then as ancient beasts, it shouldn't be a problem to occasionally look at the sky, right? Even if a meat pie dropped, they could still take a bite out of it? They could not let the humans take all the advantages, right? Unable to make a suitable decision, they could only worship their ancestors and hope to receive some advice from them. This was the reason why the ancient beasts in the Heaven's Choice Continent were getting more and more frequent. Chapter 1261. The primordial beast sacrificial ceremony had its own characteristics, and it was different from the humans. The humans' sacrificial ceremony was more of a show of their attitude to the people below them. In fact, they didn't really care whether the ancestors of heaven and earth said anything or not. Even if they did, they would suspect that something was behind it to confuse the public. The primordial beast sacrificial ceremony was much more practical. They really showed signs, but they didn't show any signs. Usually, the good ones didn't show up, while the bad ones did. This was because in the long process of fighting against the humans, they were often played in the palms of the humans due to their inferior intelligence. Of course, the primordial beasts wouldn't admit this. They always hoped that their ancestors would give them some kind of revelation to light up their future path. The primordial beasts' practicality was also reflected in their sacrificial ceremony. They put in a lot of effort, and used the power of their bloodline that humans didn't have. In this aspect, humans were indeed incomparable, because their bloodlines were more mixed. Humans evolved through mixing, while primordial beasts relied on purity to continue their strength. This was the fundamental difference. This sacrificial ceremony had been going on for a long time. Firstly, the primordial beasts were very sincere. The procedures were very complicated, and they weren't willing to cut corners. Secondly, because there were too many ancestors, it was very time-consuming to perform them one by one. There were tens of thousands of species of primordial beasts in the primordial era, and this was after a long period of survival of the fittest. Even though there weren't many left now, there were still dozens of species. To the primordial beasts, there was no one bloodline that everyone recognized. They were all arrogant and didn't want to submit to each other. It was even more impossible for them to worship a bloodline just because it was stronger. This was the bottom line that the primordial beasts couldn't violate. In fact, it was the same in the origin world. Who had ever heard of a dragon worshipping a phoenix? Kunpeng worshipping a qilin? The Shangliu clan, Nine Infant, Swanee, Jiao Duan Ba Serpent, Fei, Chiseltooth, Fuzhu, Feilian, Chimhuang, all primeval beasts with half-immortals in their clan would take turns to go through their clan's ritual. This took up a lot of time. Among the immemorial beasts chosen by the heavens, there were naturally differences in status as well. This was reflected in the process. Those with lower status would come first, while those with higher status would come in the middle, and those with lower status would come in the end. Originally, the pure immemorial beasts didn't pay much attention to these things. They were all immemorial beasts, but after being influenced by humans for a long time, they didn't learn much about the good things, but they did learn a lot about these fake and stupid rules. The sacrificial ceremony had dragged on for over a year, and the swamp of peace was filled with despair. It was not because of impatience, but because none of the old ancestors had passed down any message. In their opinion, in the long river of history, even primordial immortal beasts would occasionally pass down immortal prophecies. No matter how mysterious the place these half-immortal old ancestors went, how could it be more mysterious than the 36 heavens immortal court? But why couldn't any message be passed down? In the beginning, the ones who went up to the altar to communicate with the ancestors were the Chiseltooth, Fuzhu, Fei Lian, and the other weaker immemorial beasts. They begged here and there, but they didn't get anything. After warming up, the ceremony became even more grand, and the offerings were even more plentiful. Other than the humans, they used everything they could think of, but it was all to no avail. Baxi, Jiaoduan, Baiyan, Jiaoying, Xianglu, these noble races went up one by one, but they all failed on the verge of success. They already had a premonition that this large-scale sacrificial ceremony would end in failure. This kind of ending had happened many times in the past few hundred years, and this made the immemorial beasts who were always passionate about this kind of ceremony lose their spirits, and were extremely disappointed. In the end, there were only 2 clans left, but almost no immemorial beast held any hope, and thus, they seemed to be somewhat lacking. Qinghuang and Fei Yu were these 2 clans. In the sacrificial ceremony of the heavens-chosen ancient races, the positions of the other clans would always change according to the increase and decrease of their strength. Only these 2 clans were fixed as the leader and vice-leader, forever chasing ducks, fixed as the tail. They were never valued, and sometimes, the sacrificial ceremony of these 2 clans would even be skipped. There was a historical reason for this. Because 10,000 years ago, these 2 clans colluded with other clans, their conduct was improper, and they betrayed their own clans. They were condemned by thousands of beasts, and their positions were low, never to rise again. Clans with a stain on their history were the labels of these 2 clans. Fat cattle and egg yolk looked left and right timidly. According to the order, it was their turn to go up for the sacrificial ceremony. However, the rules of 10,000 years had been passed down, and their clans were dispensable, so they still had to ask the high-ranking immemorial beasts if they wanted to go up. No one had set such a rule, but it was an unspoken rule. 10,000 years of experience of being suppressed had already taught them how to survive in adversity. Fat Cattle was now the leader of the Fei clan, and Egg Yolk was the elder of the Qinghuang clan. They were now the representatives of their respective clans, and when it was their turn, they had to show their attitude. Whether they wanted to sacrifice or not, it was up to them. However, this process had to be done. If you kept pretending to be dead, you would also be accused of being disrespectful. When they reached the area of the high-ranking immemorial beasts, Fat Cattle carefully opened his mouth. "Fellow Grand Monarchs, do you think it's time to clean up the sacrificial altar?" Actually, he wasn't asking if they wanted to clean up the sacrificial altar, but if they still wanted to go up. He was being more tactful, as he was afraid of provoking these Grand Monarchs who were obviously in a bad mood. The immemorial beasts didn't say anything, and one of them, a Xiang Lu, shook his head impatiently. "Since the start of the sacrificial ceremony, there have been 400 days and 4 days. This number isn't auspicious, so both of your clans will go up together for 2 days. The process will be simple, and it will suffice." The two beasts nodded and bowed submissively. Other people sacrificed to pray for their ancestors to open their eyes, but for them, it was just to make up the numbers. There was nothing to be dissatisfied about. After 10,000 years, they were already used to all this. Moreover, to be honest, the number of half-immortal old ancestors of their clans in the unspeakable place was indeed pitifully few. It could be assumed that they had a hard time in that place. Other beasts couldn't even ask for a trace of them, so they naturally couldn't ask for one. Anyway, it was just for show, so it didn't matter. Although it was very awkward, they couldn't show it on their faces. They had to act as if they were overwhelmed by the favor. For immemorial beasts, it wasn't easy to do this. However, the Fei and Chenghuang, these two immemorial beasts, were the most patient among the immemorial beasts. Their minds were also the most flexible. After being educated for 10,000 years, they were very familiar with doing all this. The two immemorial beasts climbed up the sacrificial altar and moved quickly, starting to set up the sacrificial ceremony that belonged to the two clans. Although they were all immemorial beasts, the habits of each clan were still different, and there were always subtle differences. For example, the Grand Monarch's food preferences. Some liked to eat live, some liked to nibble on braised food, some liked to eat meat, and some liked to drink water. For example, the Grand Monarchs of these two clans both liked to eat places with muscles and brains. This was also one of the reasons why other beasts didn't like them. They didn't have the temperament of immemorial beasts at all. Instead, they learned some strange habits from humans. Soon, the ceremony was done. The two immemorial beasts knelt in front of the altar. Fat Cow opened his mouth, and countless grievances poured out. "Uncle D, after you leave, we have no one to rely on. Our lives are getting more and more difficult." Chapter 1262. Fat Cattle and Egg Yolk were not begging the elder ancestor to speak, they were simply pouring out their grievances. Anyway, they had nothing to lose, the elder ancestor might not be able to hear them. They had 2 days' time, they had to make the most of it. Otherwise, if the high-level immemorial beasts below became impatient, they would have to suffer. Therefore, it was best to go through the rough procedures within a day. Although it was a sloppy ceremony, there was one thing that could not be omitted, and that was the final operation of opening the space, offering sacrifices, and receiving guidance. Human sacrifices were just for show. No god would take a fancy to those so-called sacrifices. After the ceremony was over, they would be sent back to the kitchen for the little people below to have a good meal. However, the sacrifices of the ancient beasts were real. They were born with the ability to teleport, and they relied on the guidance of their bloodline in the unseen world. If it was another occasion, the possibility of the sacrifices being sent to the elder ancestor was very high. However, the situation in the unspeakable place now, and whether the sacrifices could be sent safely was very unclear. This was a two-way passage. The little ones below would send their offerings up, and the elder ancestor above would pass down instructions through some method. It could be a sentence, or it could be something. There was no fixed number. Fat cattle and egg yolk worked together and used their supernatural powers to open the space passage. The passage was a little unstable, it was limited by the realm. If it was completely stable and could enter and leave freely, it had to be at the level of a half-immortal. However, it did not matter to them, it was not a living sacrifice anyway, it was just a pile of offal. The duration of this passage was not determined by one's strength, but by one's status. For example, the Fei, Chao Ji, Fu Zhu, Fei Lian, Qing Huang, and the rest of the lower status would be shorter. The Ba Serpent, Jiao Duan, Bayan, 9 infants, and the Shengliu clan, these noble clans would be as long as possible. The reason was simple, the stronger one was, the higher his status in the upper realm. The information he received would be more accurate, so of course, he had to put in a lot of effort. The space passage was established, and the inside was flickering, like a small eye that was constantly blinking. The two beasts seized the time and threw a large pile of broken bits and pieces into the passage. This process was within their plan, and they did not expect any response. It was fine as long as the procedure could be completed smoothly without any trouble. After throwing out the offerings, the two of them quickly began to pray. Because they knew that there would be no response, they spoke quickly and vaguely. After reciting a long paragraph of long-winded sacrificial rites, they prepared to call it a day. At this moment, the blinking spatial passageway suddenly stabilized. It was no longer blinking. Instead, it looked like it had widened its eyes. Moreover, there was an indescribable radiance emitting from it. This was an omen from the imperial edict. The thousands of ancient beasts present were no stranger to this. This was what they had been looking forward to all along. Fat cow and egg yolk were dumbfounded. They were shocked by this unexpected change. They even forgot to use their demonic powers to maintain the passageway. However, the passageway didn't seem to need their support. It was completely out of their control. Uncle D is going to have news. Fat Cow was inexplicably excited. No matter what news it was, other ancient beasts couldn't ask for it. However, the two of them could. This was an honor. However, would the other ancient beasts be even more jealous and oppressed? The two beasts' worries weren't groundless. There were actual precedents. Just as they were still hesitating and the other ancient beasts were shocked, a 9-headed snakelet true lord leaped onto the altar and shouted, "There's something strange here. Why didn't the great sages issue the edict, but you two despicable races are different? From what I can see, it's you guys who opened the wrong passage and lured that filthy thing out. After I seal it, I'll settle the score with the two of you. I'll punish you for disrespecting your ancestors and offering sacrifices in an unruly manner." Before the 9-headed snakelet finished speaking, he didn't give them any time to explain. His 9 snake heads shook and roared silently at the eye. This was the 9-headed snakelet tribe's unique method of disrupting the passageway. It was called 9-split void. The divine power was very sharp. The eye started to blink again. This was a sign of instability. Some of the surrounding ancient beasts were indifferent, while some were dissatisfied. Those who were indifferent were the upper-level immemorial beasts, but most of them were dissatisfied. They were subordinates who did not have a high status. They were not on good terms with the Fei Qinghuang, but purely wanted to know what news the upper realm had sent. Personal grudges were personal grudges. Big matters were big matters. This concerned the future of the entire ancient beast race. The actions of these upper-level ancient beasts weren't convincing at all. However, the blinking eye didn't seem to be convinced. Although the blinking became more intense, the brilliance became brighter. It was as if it was sending flirtatious glances. Flirtatious glances. The 9-headed snakelet was about to increase its strength. However, it didn't expect the eye to overflow with substance. The eye emitted light. No, it was sword light. Sword light that covered the sky and earth appeared in the blink of an eye. It was already impossible to count how many rays of light there were, because they were too dense and too bright. How could the nine-headed snakelet, who was so close, predict such a change? There was no space or leeway to dodge at all. In an instant, it was pierced by millions of flying swords. The ancient beasts cultivated their own system. Their bodies were incomparably strong compared to humans, and their lifespans were easily hundreds of thousands of years. It was precisely because of this innate advantage that they didn't need to sever 3 lives like human young gods when they reached the late stage of true monarch. A casual and unguarded action had caused countless lives to be buried here. All the ancient great monarchs stood up. If they died in another way, they would have countless divine powers to attack the blinking eye. However, these were flying swords. More than 10,000 years ago, the same flying swords had caused almost half of the 5 most noble races of the ancient era to be wiped out. Even now, they still hadn't recovered. And this was under the situation where they immediately lowered their heads and admitted defeat. Now, this happened again? Because of their endless lifespan, these ancient beasts' strength increased very slowly. 10,000 years ago, they were basically true monarchs. 10,000 years later, they would still be true monarchs. What didn't change wasn't only their realm cultivation, but also their past memories. This was something they couldn't forget for the rest of their lives. What was vexing was that the heavens seemed to be afraid they wouldn't remember it well, so they helped them remember it again to deepen their impressions. Therefore, even if the most noble 9-headed snakelet clan leader was killed, because they remembered the shame and fear of the past, no ancient beast dared to act impulsively. This was because the significance of the sword light was too frightening. This was because human cultivators had spread a rumor that the master of the sword steel was the founder of the universe's new era, and also the gravedigger of the old era. Although they didn't quite believe such an exaggeration and could still suppress the 2 ancient bugs like before, when the sword light truly appeared before their eyes, fear far surpassed their instincts. Even if it wasn't that person's Tao legacy had once left them with unforgettable memories, and not just one. Damn it, it was a nest. Chapter 1263. Thus, they could only watch intently as a young Taoist turned into a stream of light and passed through. His entire body seemed to be wrapped in a long sword chi dragon. The sword river hung between heaven and earth, as vigorous as a swimming dragon. On the forehead of the dragon head, there was a person standing like a pine tree. Once the sword chi dragon appeared, it was not at ease. First, it soared into the sky, then kowtowed to the north, south, west, and east. What was even more soul-stirring than the sword light was the Taoist's pair of cold eyes. They seemed emotionless, neither happy nor sad, but all the primordial beasts present felt a certain premonition in the depths of their souls. In an instant, it felt like the end of the world. It felt like the era was about to change. Every beast had to accept this Taoist judgment of life and death. It was not killing intent, but it was better than killing intent. In the killing intent, the primordial beasts could still resist, but in the eyes of this Taoist, it was as if any resistance was meaningless. The result was destined. The future was destined. It was destined. Primordial beasts trusted intuition the most. They trusted their instincts far more than rational analysis. There were painful memories before. Then there was this sovereign's judgment. From then on, the impulse to attack was no longer there. There was only a strong sense of uneasiness in their hearts. Thousands of primordial beasts had fallen into a temporary state of being at the mercy of others. Lu Xiaoyu was really going all out this time. If he did not go all out, he knew that he was destined to not be able to survive under the hands of the Sun God. Therefore, he was gradually accumulating power in the spatial passage, striving to be able to bloom with the brilliance that belonged to the swordsman at the end of his life. He was not greedy. Even if he could not kill the Sun God, he would kill him once and let him know that even the Yin God swordsman could not be underestimated by any Sun God. This kind of accumulation was sublimated once again when he reached the end of the spatial passage. Because the sun god was destroying his spatial passage. He wanted him to be lost in the alternate dimension forever. The immersive danger made Lu Xiaoyi's hair stand on end. Under the crisis awareness, he suddenly broke through the bottleneck and shackles of the death gaze that he had been practicing. His whole person returned to calmness, and all the external forces disappeared, leaving only that one gaze. The flying swords rushed out, but they were just the vanguard. More importantly, he had to see his opponent as soon as he left this place. Only then would he be able to unleash his first slash after attaining mastery of the Tao of Slaughter Realm. Thus, he leaped into the air. Oh no, he didn't see anything. Therefore, when the four sides kowtowed, there was still nothing. Only a large group of dumbfounded primordial beasts were left standing there like wooden chickens. Because he was too focused on killing, it was as if there was nothing else in his eyes other than that possible enemy. Only when he realized that something was wrong did he realize that the environment was not right. This was not the void. Death gaze slowly dissipated, and divine sense spread out. F*CK, why did Heaven's Choice come back? Furthermore, this place seemed to be the northern territory mentioned in the legend of Heaven's Choice. The place where ancient ferocious beasts gathered. After recovering from his desire to survive, he had a general understanding of his surroundings. Although he was still not clear about the current situation, he immediately realized that he had come from one dangerous place to another. However, the previous danger came from the human young spirit, and now the danger came from a large number of immemorial beast great demons with the same cultivation level as him. This was because he knew very well that he seemed to have killed something before he drilled out of the spatial tunnel. Although he felt very wrong, why were you standing at the entrance of the spatial tunnel for no reason? It was obvious that you had destroyed the spatial tunnel. In order to protect himself, how could he hold back? Ask clearly in advance? Say excuse me? The current situation was complicated and unclear, but there was one thing that as a veteran of fighting, he was very clear about. He must not apologize. He must not show weakness. He must not have diarrhea. Even if he had to pretend to be a peerless expert. This was his only chance to live. Therefore, his eyes were still sharp, and his aura was still full. He quietly hovered above the altar, like an eagle looking at the countless ants on the ground. Even if in his heart, he really wanted to run away. The spatial tunnel drawn by the 3 points Xian was slowly being annihilated, but there was still a flash of light inside. As the background, it hung behind the Taoist. This scene seemed familiar to him. However, 10,000 years ago, it was a mottled shadow drawn by a phoenix. This time, it had become an inexplicable spatial tunnel. Pretending to be a great god also required skill. Below was obviously an altar. Therefore, he had a general idea of what to say and how to guess. An indifferent voice sounded above the swamp of peace. What is the name of the lower realm? Why are you little beasts gathered here? Why don't you tell me the truth? The immemorial beasts could not help but feel even more fearful. Just these 3 short sentences contained too much information. Lower realm? Heaven's Choice was already one of the top existences in the normal cultivation world of the universe. This was unique in the anti-space. Even if it was placed in the main world, there was no one else who could compare, including that unworthy Zhou Xian. Then, if this place was the lower realm, where did this Taoist come from? It must be the upper realm. The immortal court was a little overboard, but in this universe, other than the immortal court, there were a few places that ordinary cultivators could not go, including the legendary inside-outside scenic sky. Little beasts? Immemorial beasts were already the top existences in the universe, right? Including the Shangliu 9 infants here, and also the Phoenix and Kunping of the main world. Of course, it might not be the case in the upper realm, tell the truth. This was a trial for beasts. Under the watchful eyes of thousands of immemorial beasts, he could still speak like this. That was the habit of being arrogant and bossy in the upper realm. Was this kind of temperament something that could be faked in a hurry? The Shangyu clan and the other immemorial beasts still could not figure out this Taoist's background, temperament, likes and dislikes, and even his background. They only felt that it was extremely inconceivable. They had never heard of a living person being sacrificed during the ancestral worship process. Since they could not figure out his background, it was not good for them to go up and speak. Because these immemorial beasts did not have a good relationship with the sword vein. They were the targets that had been beaten up time and time again. The area of their psychological trauma was not small. Thus, under the signal of his eyes, Fat Cattle had no choice but to bite the bullet. Who asked him to provoke this Taoist? With him standing up for him, this time, the immemorial beasts were indeed not bullying him. Master, please calm down. This little demon, Fat Cattle, is the main sacrifice this time. It is also to communicate with the ancestors above. It is not a private gathering with ulterior motives. This is the Heaven's Choice continent. I am a little demon from the lower realm. Please forgive me for disturbing Master. Lu Xiaoyi's eyes were very sharp. With just a glance, he could tell that this two-bodied demon was special. It was actually of the same species as the one he met in the void. Instantly, he understood many things. He also understood that Fat Cattle's origins were not as simple as Yuanying void beasts. His thoughts flashed, and he took out a piece of ink scale, lying as he opened his mouth. I was wondering why I was here. So it was this piece of ink scale that caused trouble, delaying my journey. Fat Cattle looked at the ink scale and wailed. Master, that is the scale on my ancestor's forehead. It is more precious than life. What did you do to it? Chapter 1264. There were only 3 strange scales on the Fei's forehead. They were very mysterious and were unique to every immemorial beast. As long as they were still alive, they would not lose them. Of course, this kind of uniqueness was different for different immemorial beasts. For example, Changhuan had the 4 hairs under its abdomen, Jiuying had the tail bell, and so on. What did it mean for such a treasure to fall into his hands? Fat Ox trembled when he thought about it. Even if he had been bullied for 10,000 years and lost most of his temper, he still had a trace of courage in his blood. However, his emotional changes could not be hidden from the immemorial beasts around him. A Xianglu patted his body and warned him with his divine sense. Fat Ox! If you dare to make a scene, there's no need for Master to make a move. I'll deal with you first. Including your entire Fei clan. Ask carefully, don't be so impulsive. Didn't we endure when Jiuying clan leader was killed just now? These immemorial beasts saw clearly that the ink scales were indeed the few remaining half-immortal beasts of the Fei clan and Chenghuang clan. The aura of the items on Fat D's body was not wrong. All immemorial beasts had such confidence. They did not care whether Fat D was dead or not. If that old guy did not hide in the negative space, he would have died long ago. What they really cared about was that since he could hold Fat D's treasure, needless to say, this Taoist must be someone who came down from the unspeakable place. In other words, this guy was pretending to be weak, but he was actually a half-immortal. As for why all the half-immortals were taken to the unspeakable place, and why this person could sneak down, this was not something they could guess. Humans were the best at exploiting loopholes. There were no loopholes in the rules that they could not find. Not to mention the unspeakable place, even in the immortal court, there were immortals who sneaked down. This was not a big deal. At least it had nothing to do with him, because he did not even have a way to report to the heavens. He only knew that he could not offend this Taoist. He could not ruin the future of the entire Heaven's Choice immemorial beasts just because of the impulsiveness of the Fei clan. He still had to hold on to him, and see if he could get some information from the heavens. Perhaps this was the reason why he came down. Therefore, he laughed. Master, this Fat Ox's brain is not good. He is a little stupid. You must not be angry with such a stupid beast. Fei Di is one of the few half-immortals in his clan, So he was a bit impulsive because of you. Lu Xiaoyi sneered. It was just a bet, and I won a scale plate from it. You think too much. If I had really killed it, I wouldn't have just one, but 3. He pretended to be calm and collected, thinking that he had made the right choice. At least for the time being, these ancient beasts had been bewitched by him, and didn't dare to touch him for the time being. He had finally made it through this inexplicable crisis. Fatty D had insisted on giving this piece of scale to him when he was in the negative space. He said that if he ever had the chance to enter the negative space again, he could use this piece of scale to find it. Later on, he did try a few times, but he didn't even see a single strand of Fatty's hair. So, he didn't take it to heart. What else could he expect from a void beast? However, when he saw Fei D, he immediately realized that Fei D was an ancient beast in the negative space. Moreover, he saw that Fei D was traveling alone, so his status and strength must be quite high. So, he took out this thing and showed it to him. It worked. Now, it seemed that Fei D wasn't lying. It was just that he was taken to the unspeakable place and couldn't fulfill his promise. He had no choice but to do so. Although, he still couldn't understand why a half-immortal ancient beast would purposely get close to him back then. There was something fishy about this matter, but he would think about it later. Right now, he needed to fool these ancient beasts so that he could escape as soon as possible. Shangliu clan and the upper-level ancient beasts discussed for a while, and came to a decision. The whole thing was very strange, and they couldn't make an accurate judgment. They were all ancient beasts that had lived for tens of thousands of years. With their cultivation, they couldn't possibly be stupid. For example, how did this Taoist come out of the sacrificial passage? This wasn't within the capabilities of a true Lord Ancient Beast. In fact, many half-immortal ancient beasts couldn't do it, just like that Fei D. The swordsman's sword was indeed very sharp and hard to block. However, he was still at the level of a true lord. Looking at his cultivation, he was just a master true lord. Other than that terrifying look when he first appeared, there was nothing else that could prove that this Taoist was a half-immortal human. Did he hide his cultivation? Perhaps he could hide from these ancient beasts, but how did he hide from the heavenly Tao? This wasn't a suspicion. There were many proofs, such as the scale plate. However, there were also many strange things that needed time to prove. It wasn't that they didn't care that the Jiaoying tribe leader was killed. However, before they could determine this Taoist's background, they couldn't act rashly. The memories from 10,000 years ago were too deep. They didn't dare to forget. Therefore, the best way was to ask for advice. Master, we've been waiting in the lower realm for a long time. We've been hoping that the upper realm would bring us some news and help us through these difficult times. Please give us a clear indication on behalf of Brother Jiaoying tribe leader who sacrificed himself to welcome you. Chapter 1265. Lu Xiaoyi settled down in the depths of the Northern Territory. Since he had made a sufficient gesture, as the saying goes, the Tao cannot be easily passed down. Of course, he had to put on a good show. Good food, good drink, and good shelter, but the immemorial female beast really couldn't stand it. Even if his taste was heavy, he could only give up. There was no reason for everyone to leave the Swamp of Peace. It was just that the master didn't like such a dark and damp place, saying that it wasn't suitable for humans to stay in. The immemorial beast understood very well, so they found a cultivation immortal scenery in the Northern Territory that was most suitable for humans to appreciate. There was sunlight, fresh flowers, green plants, and streams. They even found a group of the most gentle beasts to be auspicious beasts. Humans just loved this kind of atmosphere. Of course, they actually didn't know what kind of place the unspeakable place was. Presumably, it was a real immortal realm, right? Wine, it was really the best immortal wine in the Northern Territory. It was purely brewed naturally. Of course, there were also top-grade wines obtained from humans. Meat, in terms of raw materials, was the freshest, softest, and most delicious part. Of course, the culinary skills were very ordinary, so they could only make do with it. The immemorial beasts were very patient. They were all at the level of supremes, so they didn't lack these few days of delay. They were great cultivators from the upper realm, so it was normal for them to pay attention to various aspects. It was human nature to put on airs, so they were already used to it. After recuperating like this for more than 10 days, Lu Xiaoyi's injuries were more or less healed. Originally, in his current state, even if he left directly, there might not be any beast here that could really stop him. Of course, there were many immemorial beasts here who were at the level of Sun God, but there was still a gap between them and the human Sun God. He had this confidence. The reason why he didn't leave was that he suddenly felt that this kind of opportunity was actually very rare. If he could fool these immemorial beasts on the big picture, wouldn't he have an additional huge force to support him in the Heaven's Choice continent? If he just ran away like this, then he wouldn't get anything. Instead, he would attract the hostility and pursuit of the immemorial beasts. It wasn't worth it. When it came to fooling and talking about some twisted logic, he still had a lot of experience. Thus, he was happy and content, and his attitude was relaxed, causing the ancient beasts to trust him even more. On this day, in the middle of a sea of bamboo, a bed was suspended in the air. A Taoist was reclining on it lazily and contentedly. This was Lu Xiaoyi's mischievous hobby from his previous life. He always felt that the sea of bamboo was particularly sentimental and could cultivate one's temperament. It was especially suitable for a person of his temperament. There were a few large jade plates floating on top of the bed. There were fruits, vegetables and peaches, fine wine, and barbecued meat and fish soup. It was so carefree and happy. In the bamboo forest, a group of bamboo snakes were dancing, a few old crows were singing loudly, and a group of giant toads were beating drums. Although the performance was not in line with the preferences of humans, it won in the local flavor, with a primitive wildness, very natural. Forget it, I'll just treat it as a mole cricket squawking. His hands were tapping the beat, and he was closing his eyes to take a nap when he felt a few figures slowly floating over. He knew that it was the Shangliu clan and a few other great demons who came to drink with him. He was very clear about the true intentions of these ancient beasts. It had been more than 10 days, and they had put on enough airs. Their temperaments had been worn down, and it was time for them to show their true colors. The so-called exalted immortal's temperament was the most taboo. He did not open his eyes, and only gave a faint order. Sigh! The suffering of the lower realm, without immortal pills to eat, without fine wine to drink, without music to enjoy, without the shape of a beautiful woman, it's so tasteless, it's really. Forget it, seeing that all of you have done your best, I'll summon all of you here. I'll enlighten all of you on the bed. The ancient beasts were overjoyed when they heard that. They had waited for so many days, wasn't it all for this day? This Taoist was also a loner. He was pretentious and had a lot of nonsense, but at least he still remembered the important matter. Hence, he summoned them with his consciousness. Not long after, the ancient beasts who had sacrificed at the sacrificial altar were gathered here again. It was obvious that they had not left, and were waiting for him to pass down the upper realm's guidance. Well, this was related to the new era. Ancient beasts like them had to pass through this hurdle in terms of lifespan, so who would not take it to heart? Seeing that all the clans had gathered, he started to pretend that his head was hurting again, and his expression was displeased. There are too many beasts. Too many. Techniques can't be passed down easily, and Tao can't enter 6 years. There are so many of you, where is the slightest bit of respect for the great Tao? Forget it, I can only put up with it, and think about where I am. How about this, each clan can discuss among themselves first. Each clan will have one question, and there's no need to repeat it. Sigh, there are also dozens of questions. Just thinking about it gives me a headache. It's not good for me to think too much. Once I think too much, I'll feel dizzy. If there's no spiritual opportunity to replenish, I'll feel sleepy. This was blatantly asking for benefits. However, the more shameless he was, the more the ancient beasts believed him, because human cultivators were indeed like this. Clan leader Jiao Duan was a little dissatisfied. Master, we've waited here for more than 10 days, isn't one question a little too little for each clan? Lu Xiaoyi glared at him. Waited for more than 10 days? You have dozens of clans, and you think it's too little? You know that we've waited for hundreds of years above, and when we finally got an imperial edict, it's just a few sentences. 3 questions are too much. Shang Liu smiled. Master, of course we can't compare to the half-immortal elder. As beasts, we're a little stupid. If we don't ask enough questions, I'm afraid we won't understand. Lu Xiaoyi slowly pulled a long face and stared at the beasts. If the great Tao is true, 1 sentence is enough. You're lucky to have met me, and if you really meet someone who cherishes his words, I'll give you a gatha, or use objects to express the meaning, or make some clever remarks. I'm afraid you'll have to go back and think about it for hundreds of years. Shang Liu was a little anxious. Don't. Master, we've actually been praying for hundreds of years below. It's not that we can't endure these 10 days. You'd better be more straightforward. If you go too deep, I'm afraid there will be too many beasts, and we'll have different opinions. Lu Xiaoyi picked up a green fruit and put it in his mouth, and closed his eyes again. Compared to this fruit, it's slightly sour in the mouth, then sweet in the throat, cool in the stomach, rotten in the intestines, stinky when out of the pylorus. Then tell me, is this green fruit sour? Is it sweet? Or stinky? Don't always talk to me about stupid nonsense. The great Tao doesn't belong to reckless people. If you can't figure it out now, go back and think more. If you don't use your own brain, and only want others to point out the path clearly to you, I think you won't go far on this path. Remember, some questions are destined to have no answers. They change, and you need to find them yourself, judge them, and participate in them. Integrate into the trend of the great Tao, and become a part of it, then you'll have a chance to find your own place in the new era. Otherwise, if I stay here all day and feel sorry for myself, and wait for the ancestors to point the way, I'm afraid I'll also die. Lu Xiaoyi was shrouded in fog, and even he didn't know what he was saying, but the group of ancient beasts listened with deep respect. This was the power of the emissary from the upper realm. Even his fart smelled good. Chapter 1266. However, this bullshit was still very useful. Realizing that the information from the upper realm might be scarce and vague, the immemorial beasts were very serious. Not only were each clan discussing what questions they needed to ask the most, but there was also communication between the clans, trying to solve all the doubts in one go so that everyone would have a clearer direction. They were all old demons that were tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of years old. Although they lived in a remote corner and rarely came into contact with others, they had their own way of inheriting immemorial beasts. It was an instinctive way that might not form a system, but it could often lead to the core. The more Lu Xiaoyi said this, the more they believed in him. If the Taoists took on everything and spoke on behalf of the heavens, they would have been suspicious long ago. Lu Xiaoyi made a sufficient gesture, and the immemorial beasts gradually came to an agreement. Abayan was the first to speak. Exalted Master, how will the world change when the era restarts? Lu Xiaoyi acted as if he did not hear it. He closed his eyes and pretended not to hear it. After a long time, Bayan finally could not hold it in. Exalted Master? Lu Xiaoyi turned over. You're asking the wrong person. You should ask Hong Mao. The immemorial beasts were very embarrassed. Then, they understood the limits of this exalted master. Yes, how would the world change? Not to mention half-immortals, even true immortals and golden immortals would not know, right? This kind of thing was impossible to predict. It was still too big of a question. They needed to ask more realistically, with a shorter timeline and a smaller scope. Otherwise, Exalted Master would either not say or talk nonsense. They actually did not understand that this grandson had been talking nonsense all along. Immemorial beasts born in chaos, will they end in chaos? Will another life form be born in the universe? This time, it was Jiao Duan's turn. Lu Xiaoyi finally opened his dead fish eyes and hit the nail on the head. Your question is actually to ask whether this change is a small era or an eternal era? No one can be sure about this. All you need to know is that the immemorial beasts will not be singled out for life and death. If it ends in chaos, then all creatures will end in chaos, including humans. It will not end in you immemorial beasts. Are you satisfied with this answer? Not only Bayan, but all the other primordial beasts also breathed a sigh of relief. It was reasonable for the primordial beasts to have such worries because they were an ancient race that was born with the chaos. They were a race that was born to cultivate and had a deep connection with the birth and death of the universe. Unlike humans, who relied on a large number of people to produce cultivation materials, they were born with great effort. Primordial beasts like them were especially sensitive to the changes in the universe. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi's answer was watertight. If everyone was still here, it meant that his prophecy was accurate. If he was wrong, then everyone would die together, and no one would have the time to criticize him. His questions were irrational, and his answers were nonsensical. His main goal was to give the primordial beasts some psychological comfort. After such a huge change, the primordial beasts' hearts were in a mess. Jiao Duan cautiously asked, "Will the old ancestors return?" Lu Shui glanced at it from the corner of his eyes. "You don't want to live if the ancestor doesn't come back? Immortals have their troubles, half-immortals have their helplessness, and you have your own cultivation. You haven't weaned? Old ancestor, old ancestor, old ancestor. When will you forget about the old ancestors? Perhaps you'll have a better future." Jiao Duan was stunned for a long time. Then, he bowed and retreated. His master's mouth was foul, but every word he said was thought-provoking. Anai Nianate cautiously said, "We understand master's meaning. He wants us to pay attention to our own cultivation and not place our hopes on finding a safe path. But my primordial race has a long lifespan. Comparatively speaking, the upper realms are very slow. Those of us here will probably endure until that day, and there won't be any fundamental changes in our realms. Then, should we just sit here and watch the winds and clouds, staying out of this? Or should we throw ourselves into this great epic change? Which method is more beneficial to the primordial race?" He finally asked a meaningful question. Lu Xiaoyi thought for a while and answered, "Yes, I did. When the earth split apart, cows, sheep, donkeys, and horses didn't enter the pen. Rats moved and fled. Chickens flew into the trees. Pigs dug their pens. Ducks didn't enter the water. Dogs barked. Rabbits pricked up their ears and jumped. Pigeons flew away in fright. This is a passive reaction. As sentient beings, we need to be more proactive. In the human world, when a new dynasty arrives, only those who throw themselves into it and make a certain contribution can obtain a corresponding position in the new dynasty. Otherwise, the survival of the race will be handed over to others. Then, who do you think will give you a share of their benefits? Are primordial beasts very lovable? No one can say for sure what the future changes will be. If you want to grasp the rhythm of these changes, you can only throw yourself into it, experience it yourself, and make your own decisions. Sacrifice yourself in this process, and gain something in this process. This is the true meaning of continuing the race. Don't think of yourself as an outsider. Don't think that you have to be given a share of the new era. The universe naturally doesn't owe you anything. At the beginning of the chaos, primordial beasts were born. This isn't a rule. It's just a coincidence. If you don't work hard, who knows who the heavenly Tao will favor in the new era? Survival of the fittest, survival of the fittest. His words resonated with the primordial beast horde. In fact, this was also the question that the primordial beast horde had been hesitating about for hundreds of years. Should they stay in the north and watch coldly? Or walk out? Where should they go? Who should they join? The boa serpent shook its head. In recent years, the natural selection humans have repeatedly expressed goodwill to us. On the continent, they changed their arrogant and despotic attitude. Although they didn't say their goal, there must be a deep meaning behind it. I estimate that if this continues, at a suitable time, they might propose to form an alliance. Then, does Master think that joining hands with the natural selection humans is the best choice for the primordial beasts to participate in this revolution? If not, who else can the primordial beast horde choose? Although the boa serpent looked ferocious and only had one snake head, which was 8 less than the 9-headed infant Shangliu, its brain capacity wasn't small. It asked the biggest question that the natural selection primordial beast horde was currently facing. The core question was, it seemed that apart from the natural selection humans, the primordial beast horde didn't have any other forces they could ally with. Then, should they tie themselves to the natural selection humans' war chariot? They had no contact with the human cultivators of the origin world. The primordial beast horde of the origin world was their mortal enemy. It seemed that apart from the natural selection humans, there was no other choice. There was only one option. This made them very uneasy. They thought that they would never be able to understand the cultivation forces in the positive and negative space as well as the humans. This was the result of the primordial beast horde's self-isolation for millions of years. It wasn't just them, but also their kin in the origin world, the primordial sacred beasts. Chapter 1267. Lu Xiaoyi didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned over tiredly, looking a little tired. Of course, a cultivator like him would never get tired, but she understood the situation and went forward, taking out some things. I don't have much savings. Master, please use these. They should be able to relieve some of your fatigue. Lu Xiaoyi took a glance and saw that the 500 ziqing were neatly arranged. He was still refusing. What are you doing? My purpose for coming here is to instruct the immemorial beasts. It's also the request of many immemorial friends. Why would I come here for the spiritual vigor? Can the secrets of the great Tao be exchanged with spiritual vigor? Under Ba Shi's insistence, the master reluctantly accepted the ziqing and looked at the other beasts solemnly. There can't be a next time. Lu Xiaoyi sorted out his thoughts. The heavens' chosen human cultivation force? Yes, they definitely can't sit still. Let me ask you. Based on your feelings, is the Taoist sect more anxious? Or is the Buddhist sect more sincere? The few immemorial beasts looked at each other. Ba Shi said, Master, your question is sharp. Both of them are half concealed. In terms of progress, they're about the same. But from the perspective of us who are being roped in, the Buddhist sect seems to be more sincere. Lu Xiaoyi sighed in his heart. It was indeed so. The Buddhist sect was very careful in their work, and their concealment skills were very good. This made it very difficult for him to find out any specific information from Zhou Xian or the Heavens Chosen. But no matter how careful they were, they couldn't just do nothing. There would always be some foreshadowing going on secretly, just like with the immemorial beasts. The immemorial beasts' feelings wouldn't be wrong. They were a race that relied on their instincts to survive. For them to have such feelings, they must have felt it through the Buddhist sect's secret efforts. This was also the Buddhist sect's goal. When they really needed it, the immemorial beasts would consider left and right. It was very likely that they would sit on the Buddhist sect's side. This was something he had worked hard to find out for hundreds of years. He never thought that he would receive confirmation from the Heaven's Choice archaic beasts. It was still a little vague, but he had a general direction. The next problem was how to make it more detailed. However, he reckoned that the immemorial beasts would only know their final destination at the very last moment, or even after they had left for the void of the universe. Human cultivators would never trust immemorial beasts in this aspect. No matter what, it was a piece of good news. It was not a waste for him to spend so much effort here. Moreover, he began to wonder if it was possible to pull the Heaven's Choice archaic beasts onto the Fifth Ring battleship. Why not? In any case, it was impossible for the immemorial beasts to stay out of this. Fighting for Xianyuan and the fifth ring was better than fighting for other powers, especially the Buddhist powers. At the very least, the sword vein wouldn't play with them. In the bamboo forest, the discussion was harmonious. The guru sat cross-legged on the gums, answering the questions of the immemorial beasts. After a few days, he exhausted his mind, fainted more than 10 times, and was saved more than 10 times. His spirit was exhausted, but he still persevered. Not all the questions had answers. More than half of the questions were refused by the guru. The remaining questions were ambiguous, specious, and distorted the truth. In fact, there were only a few who could give accurate answers. Just this kind of irresponsible answer earned him tens of thousands of strands of ziqing. Don't say it was too easy. It was a coincidence of various conditions, a contest of wits, and a grasp of propriety. Moreover, although the number of strands of ziqing seemed to be quite large, if they were distributed among dozens of immemorial beasts, it should be said that he had restrained himself very much. This was also because he had the intention of winning over the immemorial beasts. Otherwise, if he fainted a few more times, he might be able to double the number. This was the difference between a long-term plan and a one-time deal. After a few days, Lu Xiaoyi fainted completely and no longer received ziqing treatment. Thus, the immemorial beasts knew that this was their master's order to chase them away. Although the guru from the upper realm didn't pass down any earth-shattering theories or some kind of prediction that subverted common sense, and didn't seem to have said much substantial things, even if it was only a small part that was useful, it was enough for them to think for a long time. Moreover, subversive things didn't sound so good. It was better to come steadily. No bad news was good news. Most of the immemorial beasts had already left, but 5 families, after leaving with the crowd, came back while the sky was dark. The Shangliu family, Jiaoying, Tao Wu, Jiao Duan, and Ba Shi. As the strongest and most knowledgeable among the immemorial beasts, they had their own opinions about this Taoist. It wasn't that they were suspicious. If this visitor from the upper realm was really selfless, open, and honest, and answered all questions, they would really be suspicious. How could there be such a human? He wasn't greedy for benefits, didn't touch meat, didn't put on airs, didn't use emotions, didn't hide secrets, and didn't have ulterior motives. Was he still human? Therefore, this so-called guru's performance didn't make them suspicious at all. Putting aside the matter of how he came down, which upper realm he mentioned wasn't important. Whether he had any contact with their half-immortal ancestors was also unknown. Since this guru might have come down to the lower realm without permission, naturally, they didn't know when he would be taken back by the higher-ups. In fact, they also vaguely knew that the quality of life in the so-called upper realm was very poor. This came from their half-immortal ancestors' occasional idle chatter. Therefore, it was normal for this Taoist to be greedy for pleasure. After being suppressed for hundreds or thousands of years, it was normal to come down and enjoy the taste of food. This was Lu Xiaoyi's unintentional action, but it coincided with the immemorial beast's rich imagination. What they were thinking now was that before this guy was taken back, they would try their best to dig out the secret hidden by this person. There must be something. After being with humans for such a long time, they knew the nature of humans too well. They must have a trump card, a secret, and something to hide, as long as you were willing to pay the price. Just like in novels, what you heard in public was one thing, and what you heard in the secret room in the backyard was another. It was different. It just depended on whether you had the ability to understand. The Shangliu family was very perceptive. He keenly noticed that the guru's posture was different from before when he was pretending to be asleep. There were 2 differences. One was that his body was lying on its side, and his feet were swaying, kicking off one of his shoes. The other was that although he was facing inward, with one hand supporting his chin, his right hand was behind his back in everyone's sight. His thumb, ring finger, and little finger were curled up, but only his middle finger and index finger were stretched out. He told this discovery to the other 4 brothers, and of course, the 4 brothers also noticed it. For people at their level, how could they kick off their shoes? How could they not stretch out their hands behind their back naturally, but show a number? There must be a reason for wearing leather pants over cotton pants. Chapter 1268. Kick off his shoes? Walking with his shoes on and going to bed with his shoes off. To humans, does this mean the sky is dark? Master wants us to come back after dark? Ba Shi was indeed the most intelligent of the 5 clans. His analysis was meticulous. The other 4 beasts nodded. That was it. There could be no other explanation. The 5 beasts were excited. They were going to be given special treatment. It could be Master's idea, or it could be the request of their ancestors in the upper realm. It made sense when he thought about it. The strength of the 5 clans far surpassed the other primeval beast clans, and they could practically represent more than half of the primeval beast clan's strength. So, why should they listen to the imperial edict with those fellows that were inferior? The cultivation world did not care about equality between beasts. This was a place where strength mattered. Jiao Duan did not want to be left behind. His right hand's gesture should not be some kind of hand spell. There's no need for that. Under such circumstances, the key is to be clear and concise. Humans have countless hand spells, and the same gesture can be divided into countless parts. How can we, immemorial beasts, understand? Master is well aware of this, so what I mean is, that is a simple word. Is this referring to the second night watch? That made sense. However, Bai Yu, who was the most straightforward among the 5 clans, had a different opinion. Maybe he wants 20,000 purple purity? This High Master is dead. Shang Liu clapped and laughed. Brother Bai, you're very insightful. We can't rule out this possibility. We're not afraid that he wants it, we're afraid that he doesn't want it. Our 5 clans have been saving for millions of years. Although we don't have many opportunities to go out into the universe, we can still take out 20,000 purple purity. Why don't we take 20,000 purple purity to visit Master at the second night watch? We'll see if we can take the purple purity. What if the Master is a man of noble character? Jiuing, who had been silent all this time, suddenly had a thought. Don't you think that the Taoist's right hand is behind his back? It's on the strong acupoint of Bai Yu. This position is the anus, and there's feces in the anus. He placed 2 words beside the feces. Could it be that he means 200,000 purple purity? Shang Liu staggered and glared at him. I think you've eaten too much feces. The buttocks are the widest part of the human body. According to your logic, shouldn't you give him 2 million purple? The 5 beasts had reached an agreement. Of course, they would not tell the other beasts, but each of the 5 families had gathered 4,000 purple primordial beasts. The primordial beasts did not need such things for their cultivation, and they were also too lazy to venture out into the universe. Therefore, to be honest, they did not have much accumulation. The 4,000 purple primordial beasts were also the foundation of their race. They were not as rich as they had imagined. Therefore, Zhou Ying's words had really incurred the wrath of everyone. In the second night watch period, the 5 big beasts quietly came back. In the depths of the bamboo forest, the Master was still sleeping soundly. How could a cultivator truly sleep when they reached such a realm? The movements of the 5 beasts could be clearly seen from afar. The reason why they were sleeping soundly was because they didn't want to wake up. Why? Of course it was because the conditions weren't good enough. The 5 beasts looked at each other helplessly. As expected, it was a stubborn spirit. Let's hope that it was 20,000 purple primordial beasts, and not 200,000 purple primordial beasts guessed. Shang Liu stepped forward gently and placed the storage ring filled with purple primordial beasts at the corner of their gums. Although they did not need the purple primordial beasts, they could use the purple primordial beasts to exchange for useful items with human cultivators. It would be a lie to say that they did not feel the pinch. They just wanted to see if the Master's advice was worth it. If it wasn't, did he really think that the primordial beasts of the north were easy to bully? He went back and waited quietly. Sure enough, not long after, the master stretched lazily, yawned, and woke up. He had smelled the scent of purple primordial beasts. The 5 beasts thought maliciously. Seeing the 5 primordial beasts, he was very surprised. You all are! Shang Liu did not mention a word about the purple primordial beasts. They were all supremes, and the master must have known about the connection between their consciousness. It was not appropriate for him to mention the gift. This was the rule. If he said it clearly, there would be no tacit understanding. It would be very awkward, and the gift would not be too clear. It would be twice the effort for half the result. Master, we still have some small problems that we have not figured out, so we came back to ask for more guidance. We didn't disturb your rest, did we? Lu Xiai smiled. No. I'm just a person who is awake in the middle of the night and sleepy during the day. You all came at the right time to relieve my boredom. After achieving a certain goal, of course, he could not keep people 1,000 miles away. It had to be said that this cultivator's brain was very good. He had copied the plot of old Mr. Wu's novel for fun, but the primordial beast saw through it immediately. This was also a reminder to him that he should not casually play with them. Otherwise, if he suffered a backlash, at least he would not be able to stay in Heaven's Choice. Of course, beasts were still beasts. They could see, but they could not see far. They could only understand 20,000 purple primordial beasts, but not 200,000 purple primordial beasts. However, he was not a greedy person. 200,000 purple primordial beasts was a bit of a joke. The primordial beasts, who had always been extravagant, might not be able to take it out. His mentality had always been a win-win situation, but he was not willing to force others into a corner. To Lu Xiui, he would never presume to be enemies. His habit was to treat everyone as friends. Unless he was forced to a certain point, he was always willing to leave people with a lifeline. As for the primordial beasts of Heaven's Choice, he felt that they were a cultivation force that could not be ignored. When the demigods retreated from the stage of cultivation in the universe, they would be of greater use. All of his considerations were based on Xianyuan, because the sword vein was an elite force. They were good at surprise attacks. What they hated were formations and formations. What they lacked was a large group of cannon fodder-level cultivator creatures who were not afraid of death. From this point of view, the swordsmen and the primordial beasts of Heaven's Choice were a good match. They had similar characteristics and complementary combat attributes. Moreover, they were both trustworthy. If they were put together, the swordsmen would be at the forefront, and the primordial beasts would be at the forefront. Both sides had the genes of not being afraid of death, not being willing to compromise, and not being afraid of difficulties. If they were put together in a possible interstellar war in the future, they would become a terrifying force. On the contrary, if the primordial beasts of Heaven's Choice were on the opposing side, how much of the precious sword vein's strength would be lost when the two sides clashed? The changes in the universe and the changes in the eras did not depend on how strong an individual was, but on how many friends you had. When you raised your arms and shouted, would you be able to make everyone listen to you? He did not know if his understanding of power was the same as his master's. However, from the moment he was an infant soul, he had been increasing his own strength and influence at the same time. Just like the 13 ancestors that Marshal Uncle Me spoke of. No matter how powerful they were, what use were they? Even after they became immortals, weren't they still forced to self-destruct and scheme for 10,000 years? He would not make such a long-term plan. He only looked at the present, and only looked at the present. No matter how strong an individual was, he could not lack friends. If there really came a day when he went up against a certain great power, he would be able to form his own team. Chapter 1269. They started to get down to business. Keeping people at arm's length was different from being approachable. If you want to borrow the power of these immemorial beasts, you can't always be high and mighty. But you can't drink with these immemorial beasts. That's the key to maintaining a sense of mystery. Relying on the power of the purple purity, Shangliu spoke. Master! We won't hide it from you. We know that in this era of great changes in the universe, it's impossible to stay out of it. In fact, before our ancestors left Heaven's choice, they specifically warned us not to be cowardly, or else we'll be abandoned by the big picture. But the only thing our ancestors couldn't figure out was how to get involved in the changes of the universe. Or rather, which camp should we be friends with? Which camp should we be enemies with? Millions of years ago, we immemorial beasts made a choice. In the end, we became immemorial beasts and were chased to Heaven's choice, losing the right to rule over the universe. And those phoenixes, rocks, dragons and Chilants became immemorial sacred beasts. They stayed in the main world and became legends. This is the consequence of making the wrong choice. Actually, in terms of appearance, which one of us can't compare to those sacred beasts? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. This guy really doesn't know how to be humble. Just the way you shake your 9 heads together, you're ugly, okay? The 21 large beast heads fixed their eyes on Lu Xiaoyi. Shangliu clan's words became straightforward, because they had had enough of this Taoist's vague words. They needed something definite, instead of being muddle-headed in the face of countless choices. Master, if you have any requests, just say it. It's on the realm level, not the purple purity. We don't even care about those things. How can we talk about Master? You don't have to hide anything. In the upper realm, it doesn't matter if your relationship with our immemorial ancestors is good or bad. Let's put them aside and talk among ourselves. Let's put it this way, you're a human. You must have your own orthodoxy and realm behind you. Then, is there a possibility of cooperation between us? How? We can't promise you anything now, because we have other options. But we can swear on the beast god that we will keep the secret between us, and when we make a choice, we will not forget the choice you gave us. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. For the ancient race to be able to survive until now, there really was a reason behind it. They weren't as crude and shallow as the rumors made them out to be. He thought he could toy with the ancient beasts in the palm of his hand, but in truth, didn't the ancient beasts see him in the same way? He had to take out something real, or else he wouldn't be able to subdue these ancient beasts. He stretched out a finger. I can provide you with a chance to cooperate with the strongest orthodoxy and strongest domain of the origin world. This was also why they were willing to forgive the death of their 9-headed snake-led clan leader. They were willing to swallow their anger, and they were willing to pay when they extorted Zi Qing and the others. There was only one reason for all of this. This was a swordsman. Their greatest fear, which was buried deep in their hearts, was also their greatest desire. If this Taoist said that he came from Xianyuan, then there was no need to say anything. The immemorial beasts never lacked the courage to bet everything they had. They were willing to form an alliance with the orthodoxy that could give birth to such a person. Daring to collapse the innate Tao, daring to change the universe, just this courage alone was worthy of their loyalty. Humans underestimated them too much. In fact, they were aware of the impact of the collapse of the innate Tao earlier than any other race. Their preparations were also thousands of years earlier than the humans. A very hidden strategy was to continue suppressing the Fei and Chenghuang races. But they could not be destroyed. Otherwise, with the Fei's meager strength, how could it be so carefree in the negative space? It would be as easy as lifting a finger for the 5 great clans to destroy it. As for Chenghuang, that was another story, and it had nothing to do with it. The purpose of this was to attract the orthodoxy of that sword immortal to come to them. Then, when the time was right, they would confess to each other and work together. In the past 10,000 years, the swordsmen had come a few times. But the timing was not right. So, they hid their plans deep in their hearts and did not say a word. This was the most secretive instruction that the immemorial half-immortals gave to the 5 great races before they left. This human swordsman came in a strange way. They did not know anything about him, so they were happy to play along with him. Actually, there was no need for him to do this. He only needed to reveal his identity, and the Heaven's Choice immemorial beasts would become the Sword Vane's most loyal allies. Because they had been wanting to leave the negative space for a long time. The immemorial sacred beasts might not have such ambitions, but the immemorial beasts did. This was their nature. Chapter 1270. But the Shangli clan also understood the swordsman's cautiousness. An alliance like this should not be formed unless it was absolutely necessary, because it would easily incur the jealousy of the heavens. It would attract the collective pressure of other cultivators. Just like how they had encountered several powerful Xianyuan half-immortals over the past 10,000 years, they would rather be beaten than reveal anything, all because the timing was not right. This swordsman must be thinking the same thing now. Therefore, the more mysterious and nonsensical the swordsman was, the more they believed him. This person must have come from that place. Everyone, let's put on this show together and see the final outcome. They were all old monsters who had lived for thousands of years, so who could possibly deceive each other? Lu Xiui also felt that something was amiss. As a veteran great hoodwinker, he inexplicably felt a sense of vigilance when things progressed so smoothly. Would it be so easy to deceive others? Even selling a crutch would take a lot of effort, let alone selling the survival and future of an entire tribe here. Where did the problem lie? He could not figure it out at the moment, but he knew very well that he had to regain the initiative. Could the primordial beast have already guessed his orthodoxy? This was not strange, because he had displayed his invincible swordsmanship the moment he appeared, and his seniors from his sect might have stirred up trouble in Heaven's Choice. Even the leader of the 5 elements, Taoist Pang, said that he was acquainted with the people from his orthodoxy. If the young gods of humans who had lived for thousands of years were like that, how could the primordial beasts who had lived for hundreds of thousands of years be clueless? He might not be able to hide his orthodoxy, but at the very least, he had to prove that he was from the upper realm. This required a bomb, something that could shock everyone and make their eyes light up. So that was what it was. How could a person who had just ascended from Yuanying to a perfected lord who was far away from his sect possibly have such information? But it did not matter. The great hoodwinker was never one to be boastful. Even if he did not have information, he would still make it up, right? In the hundreds of years since the changes in the Great Tao, he had made countless guesses about the changes in the new era based on the changes in his own little universe. Among them, he picked out one of the more shocking ones. The essence of bluffing is that once you start, you can't stop. This was a process of probing each other, suspecting each other, and understanding each other. They had to remain calm and not show any urgency. Only then would they be able to reel in the large fish that was the archaic beast horde. Both sides probed each other cautiously, until the Shangli clan raised another seemingly unsolvable question. When the universe was first formed, primordial beasts were born. At this time, the group of immemorial beasts was like a big family. Not only were there phoenixes, kunpangs, and kirins, but there were also Shangliu, Jiaoying, and Jiaoying. The reason why they were divided into 2 camps was that they each had their own position in the immemorial cultivation war, and had their own supporters. The winner was the king, and the loser was the bandit. That was why there were immemorial sacred beasts in the main world and immemorial ferocious beasts who fled to the negative space. Everyone had the same origin, so how could there be a real distinction between sacred beasts and fierce beasts? Then the question is, since Master encouraged us to go out of the negative space and go to the main world to find someone to rely on, then do you have a plan to deal with those so-called ancient sacred beasts? Among us ancient beasts, saints and ferocious beasts are sworn enemies. If we go to the origin world, we will be challenging their bottom line. The human cultivation world in the main world has always been on good terms with the ancient sacred beasts. Now that we go, how can we balance things out? How can we resolve the dispute? Or should we just ignore it and let the group of immemorial beasts have an internal fight to the death? While we're at it, we can also remove the biggest hidden danger for the human cultivation world? This question was very critical. In fact, it was asking him if this was a plot by the humans to weaken the group of immemorial beasts. There were many camps in the cultivation world of the universe, and no one could really differentiate them. There was the battle of orthodoxies, the battle of the positive and negative space, the battle of the realms, and the battle of the races. If they couldn't resolve the internal conflict of the group of immemorial beasts, as long as the fierce beasts walked out, they would definitely be attacked by the sacred beasts. This was actually the reason why the Heaven's Choice group of immemorial beasts had always been hesitant. For tens of thousands of years, they had been waiting for a solution. Unfortunately, they couldn't get what they wanted. Lu Xiaoyi's expression didn't change. It was time to release the thunder. The internal conflict of the immemorial beasts, the grudges of millions of years, if anyone says that they can resolve it, then they are lying. If I can't resolve it, the power behind me can't resolve it either. You immemorial beasts can only resolve it among yourselves. We can only say that we are willing to mediate, provide a certain opportunity, and create certain conditions. That's all. Jiu Ying's expression was unhappy. If we stand on your side, we will sacrifice ourselves and help each other, but we won't get any help from the alliance? Everything will have to be resolved by us? Lu Xiaoyi didn't back down. You have to remember one principle. It's not about what you do for us. It's about what you do for yourselves. Won't you have to pay any losses if you stand on the other side? Will Heaven's Choice care about the internal conflict of the immemorial beasts? Even if you want to stay out of it, do you think you won't have any losses if you stay in the north? There won't be any internal conflict among the immemorial beasts. The 5 beasts were all shocked when they heard the most lively sentence. What did he mean? Xian Lu said in a low voice. Master, you mean that even if we don't go out, the sacred beasts will still barge in? Barge into my Heaven's Choice continent? Lu Xiaoyi said casually. No, they don't have to barge in. But what if the boundary between the positive and negative spaces is gone after the new era? If we all live in the same universe, will the Heaven's Choice immemorial beasts continue to hide? After saying this, Lu Xiaoyi fell asleep again. This time, he didn't kick his shoes or make any gestures. He just asked them to leave. The rest was up to the immemorial beasts to figure it out themselves. The 5 immemorial beasts retreated from the bamboo forest. They had been trying to get information for so many days. Whether it was a big meeting or a small meeting, they knew that it was just a show. But the last piece of news made them completely confused. Merging the positive and negative spaces? This was completely possible. Just like when the universe was born and when the chaos was first created, where would there be a main world and a negative space? The negative space was something created by the 4 great beasts. If the new era wanted to reset the rules of heaven and earth and reopen the Khanate Great Tao, it would be equivalent to rebooting the universe. Then, where would the 4 great beasts go? Although they didn't know the changes, they were sure that they would have to break some things and rebuild some things. If the rules of heaven and earth of the 4 great beasts were gone, then the negative space would definitely be gone. If the 4 great beasts were still preserved in some way, it would be impossible for them to be undamaged. There would definitely be some huge changes. And the 4 great beasts were the weakest of the 4 great beasts. The negative space would still be hard to preserve. It wouldn't be destroyed, but it would merge with the main world again. Then, the sacred beasts and the ferocious beasts would return to the same universe, whether they were willing or not. They had to face it. This was very possible. Very possible. Lu Xiaoyi's fabricated news had indeed achieved the effect of scaring people. Because a good scam was based on reality, 90% true and 10% false. What if the scam was real? Chapter 1271. P.S. Old Fallen surrenders, I've put up the battle exemption sign. I really can't add any more. The power of capital is too terrifying, directly crushing my old waste. This is the last update for today. Tomorrow, I'll update 3 or 4 times a day, depending on the writing situation. Warm reminder, for the next 3 months, please pay attention to the reward leader. I might not be able to update you in time, sorry. My hemorrhoids are acting up, I have to find someone to rub them. Lu Shui opened his mouth wide. Who cares if you die? The positive-negative space fusion theory was based on his own body. In view of the special intuition of his body, which was reconstructed from a small universe, he blindly figured it out. He didn't mention it to anyone, it was too sudden and too shocking. In the current state of the universe's cultivation world, once this news spread out, the Heaven's Choice continent would explode. The scale of the Heaven's Choice continent's cultivators exploding would no longer be as gentle and hesitant as it was now. It would form a tide of beasts and people, vast and mighty, surging violently. No one could pull the reins, and it would inevitably bring a huge disaster to the countless domains of the Heaven's Choice continent. He couldn't bear this kind of karma. But he still took the risk, because the race of ancient beasts was the most tight-lipped of all the cultivation creatures. Even so, he didn't mention it at the meeting, but mentioned it to the 5 clan leaders in a small meeting. Moreover, he didn't mention it in detail, and it was ambiguous. Imagine it yourself. He was just afraid that these 5 guys would supplement too much. They would make him crazy. He needed to think about his current situation. How did he get to this place? He had already realized that there was a problem with the space passage. He was still a little immature under the hands of the top human sun gods. The gap in the Tao of space wasn't ordinary, so the other party had prepared a backup plan, but he barged in without knowing anything. What he was puzzled about now was whether this action was intentional or an unintentional coincidence. If it was intentional, what was the purpose of this sun god? He was more inclined to believe that it was an unintentional coincidence, because the direction in which he built the space passage was facing that sun god, which was also facing the Heaven's Choice continent. Moreover, no one came to find him after such a long time, which also meant something. He wanted to risk his life, but didn't succeed. He didn't know if he was lucky or unlucky? Plans were always unable to keep up with changes. If this was really just a coincidence, then his goal was just right for him to sneak in without anyone knowing. Xian Liuzi had once said that cultivators would be left with some kind of mysterious imprint after entering Heaven's Choice, and it would only disappear after leaving. The young god of Heaven's Choice often judged the number of outsiders based on this. Only half immortals would not leave such a mark on their bodies. In other words, his imprint had been erased. Now, he was a real black man, an identity that suited him very well. No one would pay attention to him anymore, because they all thought that he had returned to the mortal world with the delegation. I hope so. Since fate had pulled him back, this was the will of the heavens. Of course, he would not go against the flow. There were still many things he needed to unearth here. The most important thing was the nameless sword principle tablet. He didn't want to go before becoming a monarch because his realm was too low. He was afraid that the unreliable crow ancestor would lead him astray. But now, it was different. He had succeeded in becoming a monarch, and had a clear and firm understanding of his future path. He knew where his path was and how to walk it. This was the result of countless reflections and explorations during the process of becoming a monarch. In terms of practical significance, it was more important than becoming a monarch himself. At this point, no one could affect him anymore. Not even the crow ancestor. That old fart. From the map, the northern region where he was located was not too far away from the nameless sword principle tablet. It was at the border between the northern region and the human countries. It was very convenient and safe to travel because he was now an honored guest of the ancient beasts, a guide, and the spokesperson of the ancestor. But before going to the nameless sword principle tablet, he still had one thing to do. He had a question to clarify, and his intuition told him that this was very important. In the bamboo forest, there was another rustling sound. This was the second group of guests tonight. The first group was the result of him playing tricks, and the second group was the result of him directly inviting them with his divine sense. Fat Cattle ran into the bamboo forest timidly. Fortunately, it was careful. Otherwise, it wouldn't know how to explain if it bumped into the 5 unreasonable people. Why did the master leave a message for it alone and ask it to avoid being noticed? To it, this was actually very simple. It was nothing more than Uncle D leaving some private messages for it, right? After all, the master was really summoned by it. This couldn't be faked. Tell me about your Uncle D. I'm very curious about his past, Lu Xiaoyi said pleasantly. Fat Cattle didn't expect that he was summoned for this purpose. It was a little confused. Lu Xiaoyi comforted it. Don't be nervous. I don't mean any harm. Some things are better understood. It's good for us to build some kind of trust between us. Because I feel that the Fei clan of the immemorial beast seems to have some unknown karma with the sword vein. When it came to karma, Fat Cattle felt sad. Anyway, its current situation couldn't be considered a secret. Hence, under Lu Xiaoyi's guidance, it started to talk about its tragic memories. It especially focused on the karma between the Fei clan and the Crow ancestor. Thus, a series of stories were created. It spoke incoherently. Lu Xiaoyi didn't urge it. He only listened quietly. Gradually, from Fat Cattle's mouth, the Crow ancestors' traces in the Heaven's Choice mainland, especially the part about the northern land, started to become clear. Without the ancient books of the sect or the narration of the masters, Lu Xiaoyi revealed the Crow ancestors' every detail in the Heaven's Choice through the mouth of the immemorial beast. It wasn't that he wanted to do this. He was also not a person who was curious about the past of others. There were still countless dangers waiting for him in the future, even if he was once a deity. In the Heaven's Choice, he couldn't avoid the existence of the Crow ancestor. Not only the nameless Sword Dao tablet, but also many other things. Fortunately, the immemorial beast was a long-lived creature. Otherwise, after tens of thousands of years, who knew how wrong the countless generations of oral transmission would be? He finally understood Fat Cattle's intention of getting close to him. However, he was puzzled. How did Fat Cattle determine that he was the successor of Xian Yuan? Did all demi-mortals have this kind of ability? No matter what, Fat Cattle did have good intentions. Unfortunately, he didn't know it at that time and was still on guard. This Crow ancestor was also a person who didn't wipe his own butt. Why didn't he arrange for his own followers properly? He made them suffer a lot for tens of thousands of years. He could only take care of the Fei clan in the future. Of course, it was still difficult for him to do this now. Taking care was the most unreliable word in the cultivation world. In fact, at their level, in this kind of universe environment, who could take care of who? I need a guide. Are you willing to bring me to the Sword Dao tablet? Seeing Fat Cattle's hesitation, Lu Xiaoyi knew what it was thinking. Don't worry. I will talk to the 5 upper clans of the immemorial beasts. I won't make things difficult for you. I can't do anything else, but I think I can at least make your Fei clan live a better life. Chapter 1272. What surprised Lu Xiaoyi was that the 5 families of the immemorial beasts agreed to his request without any hesitation. It was as if they already knew this would happen. This made him understand that his roots were not a secret to these immemorial beasts who had lived for hundreds of thousands of years. It was just that they pretended not to know anything and played along with each other. It was supposed to be a secret return trip, but it was exposed in a short period of time. It was all because of that Crow ancestor. It was too troublesome. Declining the offer of a few big beasts to escort them was just a form of attitude. In the north, the immemorial beasts at the level of true lord knew their master. How could there be any danger? Unless they went to the human countries. Fat Cattle was very responsible as a guide. He was even a little servile. In fact, in terms of realm, he had been a true lord for tens of thousands of years. However, Lu Xiaoyi's time of becoming a true lord could only be measured by the heavens. This was the difference between humans and beasts. It was also the difference in status. It was also the embodiment of the 10,000 years of suppression that had distorted his character to a certain extent. He was very grateful to this human because just before they left, the Fey clan was sent back to their ancestral land, the place where they lived 10,000 years ago. Head south from here. In about 2 to 3 months, you will reach Willow Sea. Beside Willow Sea is the location of the nameless Sword Path Monument. Lu Xiaoyi's sleeves fluttered. Now, he finally had the temperament of a great cultivator. He even had an immemorial beast as his follower. If he was willing, there could be more. In the Heaven's Choice continent, there were countless human cultivators and hundreds of sun spirits. However, there was really no one who could be as ostentatious as him. Is there the power of an immemorial beast in Willow Sea? Fat Cattle did not react for a moment. Willow Sea is the border between the north and the human countries. There are no subordinates there. In theory, there shouldn't be any traces of immemorial beast activity there. It's the same for humans. Master, what do you mean? Of course, Lu Xiaoyi could not say that there might be people waiting to ambush him there. It was not that he was worried about the risk. He just wanted to delay the news of his return as long as possible. He did not even worry about these so-called enemies when he was in Yuanying, let alone now that he had succeeded in becoming a true lord. He needed some time to see if he could find out more about the movements of the Buddhists. Although Taoists did everything in a hurry, they were not afraid. What they were really afraid of was a dog that did not bark. In the Yuanying realm, if everyone followed the rules, there was nothing for him to be afraid of. However, now that he was a perfected lord, his opponents would naturally be promoted to the perfected lord level. No bodhisattva would attack him anymore. In the future, he would have to face a group of Buddhas, or even great Buddhas. Therefore, he still had to hide his tracks as much as possible. This was the awkwardness of a person facing a world and a region alone. It was as if he was always in the state of a rat crossing the street. Previously it was Zhou Xian. Now, it was Heaven's Choice. In troubled times, people's hearts are unpredictable. Fat Cattle, can you inform the primordial beast near the Willow Sea to scout the situation near the sword Dao Steel? Although Fat Cattle was a little wretched, he wasn't stupid. He immediately understood what his master meant. Good. 10 days before we get close to the Willow Sea, I will inform the nearby primordial beast hordes to investigate the situation. To us, this doesn't mean much. If there is a need, we can create a small beast tide near the Willow Sea. You can take advantage of the tide and enter, then you won't leave any traces. Lu Xiaoyi nodded with satisfaction. Fat Cattle was very talented. He liked to create beast tides just like his ancestor. It was also inherited. Along the way, with Fat Cattle and the encounter at the Swamp of Peace, no primordial beast came to disturb them. It was a pure journey. 5 Rings Dome. Yan Quan flew all the way and entered Wen Guangfeng's territory. Master's uncle was looking after the Soul Hall, so he came out to do some things. One of them was that senior brother Yan Bo had come out of seclusion. He needed to go over and comfort him. At the same time, senior brother gave him a mission. Senior sister Yan Qing was the one who got the news, but senior brother was the one who got it. He flew slowly and tried his best not to create any sword momentum. This was not because he was afraid of the inner sword territory, but because he respected his friends. This time, senior brother didn't succeed in breaking through. Yuanying to become a true monarch was very difficult. It was a big hurdle because a cultivator's lifespan would increase from a few thousand to 3,000. Since he stole such a long lifespan from the heavenly Tao, then it was inevitable that there was a limit to the number of people who could reach the upper realm, even if the heavenly Tao's restrictions were much looser than before. It was understandable, but when this kind of thing happened to him, he felt sad. He himself had no hope of becoming a true monarch and didn't even have the chance to try. However, a talented cultivator like senior brother Yan Bo still failed. He couldn't help but sigh. The path to the upper realm was really full of difficulties. Thousands of soldiers and horses were crossing a single log bridge. Who would have the confidence to succeed? After failing once in the upper realm, the chances of succeeding in the future would be even lower than the previous one. This was the iron law of the cultivation world. The majority of cultivators would walk on the path of no return after their first failure. This was the cruel reality. Did he need to comfort senior brother? It seemed like he didn't need to. Fortunately, he had other news to hide his purpose. The more arrogant a person was, the more they wouldn't accept other people's comfort. In the dome, which swordsman wasn't arrogant? When he came to senior brother's cave, he knocked on the array and asked, but there was no response. Either the master wasn't here, or he didn't want to see guests. Under normal circumstances, if the guests knew the rules, they should just leave and not cause trouble. However, Yan Quan knocked on the array again because he had other news that senior brother must urgently want to know. Once the array was opened, Yan Quan floated in. He saw senior brother sitting in the cave with a calm expression, but he knew that senior brother was probably blaming him for disturbing him. He didn't mention the upper realm and went straight to the point. Senior brother, I have some news about senior brother cigarette butt situation that you asked me to pay attention to. It's a big change. Even I, the guardian of the soul hall, who is used to seeing life and death, can't figure it out. As expected, this sentence immediately attracted Yen Bo's attention, and his calm expression changed. When I came out, I received senior sister's message and knew that something happened to that guy. What, is there a change? Then it must be a good change, right? Why can't I figure it out? Yan Quan smiled bitterly. Senior brother, you can't play with people like this. That senior brother cigarette butt of ours is just playing with his soul lamp. 20 years ago, senior brother cigarette butt's soul lamp was extinguished. Senior sister was also present at that time. Later, in order to find out what happened, she went to the Blue Sky sect. Just 10 days ago, before senior brother came out, I received good news. Senior brother cigarette butt's soul lamp was reignited, and it was even better than before. That fire seedling was burning. Needless to say, he succeeded in becoming a monarch. In the end, I was only happy for a few days. Just yesterday, that fire seedling was extinguished. I reported it to the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion. Guess what True Lord Rui said? He said, just throw away that guy's soul lamp. Giving birth is not giving birth. Are you trying to scare people? Chapter 1273. Yen Bo slapped his forehead as he listened. That was it? Another one? That was it? He must have entered a space that can block the appearance of soul lamps. There's no other explanation. It seems that this guy's cultivation experience is very rich. Yen Bo wasn't worried because he knew his junior brother too well. Yes, he had already become his martial uncle. There were always ups and downs in the cultivation world. From the moment they met, he was always worried that this brat would catch up to him. It came later than he expected, but now, he had finally surpassed him. He was a little sad, even though he knew it would happen sooner or later. Moreover, he seemed to be unable to run in this competition. The gap between them would only grow bigger and bigger. He was very clear about this. He was still too comfortable, even though he had already risked his life to participate in every dangerous mission. But compared to this brat's soul lamp, it was far from enough. This brat wouldn't have thrown him into a bug's nest, right? When it came to seeking death, he had to admit that he was far from being a lunatic. Yan Quan looked at his somewhat absent-minded senior brother, and was also sad. True Lord Ray said he's fine. Senior brother you... Yen Bo smiled. Don't worry about me. There's no swordsman on Wenguan Peak. I still have a chance, and I'll never give up. However, I may leave the fifth ring for a while. Thank you for your news, junior brother. I hope we'll meet again one day. Yan Quan had a premonition. Senior brother, don't tell me you also want to go back to Blue Sky. This. Yen Bo laughed. You guessed right. I also want to go back to Blue Sky and bring the news to your senior sister, I also want to tell her that if we don't work hard, I'm afraid we'll have to call that brat Marshall uncle. With your senior sister's temper, she won't call him that even if you beat her to death. Yan Quan was speechless. How could he say that? The first time the soul lamp went out, senior sister Yenqing went to blue sky. The second time the soul lamp went out, it was senior brother Yenbo's turn. If this brat kept on going out, wouldn't he only stop when he emptied the fifth ring? Senior brother, do you want to reconsider? Yenbo shook his head. This decision wasn't made lightly, and it wasn't made impulsively after hearing the news. In fact, after he failed in the upper realm, he had been thinking about this problem. What was the difference? Fortunately, he was in the early stages of forming his nascent soul this time. Once he felt that something was wrong, he immediately stopped. Otherwise, he really didn't know how to end the situation. After thinking about it for a few days, he still couldn't figure out where he was lacking. It wasn't until he heard about the cigarette but that he suddenly realized that he was lacking in the path of the upper realm and the trend of the universe's changes. The upper realm of cultivators was no longer something that could be solved by cultivating in seclusion. The success rate was extremely low. If a cultivator wanted to achieve something in this ever-changing universe, they had to completely blend into it and become one of the many people under the tide. Even if they weren't outstanding, they had to at least be an accomplice. How could he be in tune with the universe? Waiting for the sect to play a role in the future great changes of the universe was almost certain. But the problem was that he didn't have enough time. In that case, he could only find a trendsetter to follow in his footsteps. Senior sister had already taken a step ahead. She should have already noticed something. Of course, he wouldn't fall behind. Since that kid's adventure started in the azure sky, it was very likely that it would end in the azure sky. Waiting in the azure sky was much more exciting than waiting in the fifth ring for thousands of swordsmen. Although it might be dangerous, it was worth it. With his current situation, would he still care about any danger? He had already heard that there would be a floating raft heading to the azure sky in a month's time. Because the universe's situation was becoming more and more chaotic, the defense of Zhuozhou's hometown was also put on the agenda. This time, they were sending a newly promoted true lord of the inner sword back to help guard it. The name was somewhat familiar. It seemed to be true Lord Kun called Yen Dai. Did she come to the fifth ring with Little? That batch of newcomers from other regions was really amazing. Out of 10 of them, there were 2 true lords. It was unbelievable. In the left Zhou star system, in the big and small intestine blind passage, spells flew everywhere and flying swords flew everywhere. In the small space, a fierce group fight was going on. This was a battle between the outerverse cultivators and the local natives. As the general situation became more and more chaotic, this kind of battle became more and more common. In the left Zhou star system, everyone knew that because the main force had gone to the fifth ring, the cultivators in their hometown had been greatly weakened. Most of the realms were able to protect themselves, but they lacked the ability to advance. Their control over the universe's void was not as strong as it was 10,000 years ago. However, there were still some who had no scruples in the left Zhou star system. For example, a certain sword vein in a certain realm. In the group fight, the 4 swordsmen quickly gained the upper hand. Even though the opponent had 7 swordsmen, and one of them was a true lord, they were still completely suppressed by the 4 swordsmen. Gradually, casualties began to appear. 4 Yuanying swordsmen, 2 inner swordsmen, and 2 outer swordsmen. They cooperated well and fought fiercely. Among them, there were even 2 tigers. Smoker was decisive. Just follow Ice Guest's route. You are so mysterious. You are all cultivators, but you still believe in these predestined things. Li Peinan sighed and smiled bitterly to Xiaoye. The arduous journey is about to begin. Xiaoye, have you written your will? Chapter 1274. Willow Sea once had its own legend. But with the passage of time, how many people still remembered such a legend? Especially when this legend flipped the table after eating and drinking to his heart's content. Under the tacit understanding between Taoists and Buddhists, the nameless sword tablet's reputation and status among all the other tablets in the Heaven's Choice continent could not be compared to its creator's achievements. It could not be propagated like this, walking one's own path and cutting off others' paths. Only the immemorial beasts had memories of this place, because they were the beasts involved. In the past decade or so, the number of human cultivators who wandered around the sword Tao steel had suddenly increased. Regardless of whether they were in the nearby human kingdoms or in the beast territory of the northern region, these human cultivators were active in all of these places. Some were seeking revenge, some were comparing skills, some were searching for their roots, all had their own motives. Over the past 10 years, there had been countless battles, big and small, here. The two sides of the battle were clearly divided. On one side was the swordsman group of Heaven's Choice, and on the other side were the families of the victims whose relatives and friends had been killed by the Zhou Xian sword practitioners in the Echo Valley. In the beginning, both sides were evenly matched. But gradually, the advantage of the Dharma cultivators and monks became more and more obvious. Even if the relatives and friends of the victims could only make up 10 to 20%, it was still not something that a group of swordsmen with only 100 people could compare to. The swordsman group was having a hard time holding on, but fortunately, there were not many casualties. It was not because the swordsmen and monks were merciful, but because they were fighting near the sword tablet. The swordsman group always had a last resort, hiding in the tablet. Not only could the swordsmen enter the tablet, cultivators from other orthodoxies and even Buddhist monks could enter as well. But who would run into the sword tablet and fight with the swordsmen? Were they tired of living? This was the orthodoxy left behind by a deity. This situation lasted for more than 10 years. Liu Xiaoyi wandered around the continent, and then stayed in Jia country as a doorman. He did not know that there were two groups of people fighting for him. This situation changed after Zhou Xian's diplomatic mission left. Xian Liuzi was very cunning. In fact, Liu Xiaoyi wasn't the only one who didn't return on time. There were several, including Yuanying perfected monarch. No one knew why they couldn't return on time. It was probably because they lost track of time in the Great Tao Tablet, they were harmed by others, or they couldn't leave. As the leader of the team, Xian Liuzi had to consider the safety of the team, and not a few reckless fellows. Therefore, he had to leave on time. The only thing he could do was to put everyone into the floating raft and announce that everyone was present. Then, they would return home. This kind of measure could be hidden from most sects, but it could not be hidden from those who had the Sun Spirit. As long as they wanted to know, they could judge based on the imprints left behind by the people of Zhou Xian when they entered the natural selection continent. This was the only thing they could do. A group of cultivators outside the Sword Tao Tablet left, but most of them did not. This was because they found out through various sources that although Zhou Xian's diplomatic mission left, the swordsman did not leave. As long as he didn't leave, he would definitely come to the Sword Tao Tablet. They believed this without a doubt. However, a few months ago, the cultivators began to leave in large numbers. This was because there was conclusive news that the swordsman had really left. This cowardly rat was so scared that he didn't even dare to return to the Sword Vein's supreme inheritance to take a look at the Sword Tao Tablet. In a foreign land, scholars didn't dare to go to the academy, officials didn't dare to greet their colleagues, and guests didn't dare to go to the brothel. If he wasn't a rat, then what was he? Although they despised him, what was done could not be undone. Since he had already left, who could really chase after him? Only a few people with deep hatred and stubbornness were still lingering here. They probably wouldn't be able to hold on for long. However, they were not the ones who were the most disappointed. The most disappointed were another group of people, the swordsman group. The Heaven's Choice swordsman really wanted to communicate with this Zhou Xian and learn the truth about the Sword Tao Tablet. Now that the main character had left, it made them feel uneasy. There were those who were disdainful. They thought that the swordsman's reputation was undeserved and that his actual performance in the Impermanence Tao tablet was completely inconsistent with his performance in the Impermanence Tao tablet. Of course, this was only a minority. To most people, they understood the swordsman's situation in the Heaven's Choice. With so many monks obstructing him, it was very difficult for a stranger to come alone without being disturbed. He was a Yuanying, not a young spirit. There were also those who left for personal matters. Since the main character had left, there was no need for them to continue staying here. They still had to continue cultivating. This was life. However, there were still nearly half of the swordsmen who stayed. Usually, they were all in different places and cultivated on their own. They didn't have a fixed place to gather. Since they had all rushed here, it was also a good opportunity to communicate with each other. More than 50 swordsmen either entered the Sword Tao tablet to comprehend or competed outside the tablet. This place had finally returned to the past and became a paradise for swordsmen. Huang Nian was a little unhappy. He was full of enthusiasm and waited wholeheartedly, but he had wasted more than 10 years. The key was that once this person left the Heaven's Choice mainland, he didn't know when he would return again. If it was short, it would be 100 years. If it was long, everyone's lives were limited. Who could afford to wait? Banju noticed his low mood and advised, Huang Nian, don't take it to heart. We didn't come here because you invited us. We came here voluntarily. You don't have to feel burdened. Isn't there cultivation everywhere? Going back is also cultivation. Isn't it the same for staying here? It's even livelier. Moreover, although this person left, it's not like we don't know where to go. Zhou Xian isn't far. Let's plan properly and find a chance to go out together. We can enjoy the scenery of the origin world and compete with him. Why should we break off contact? All the swordsmen applauded. This was killing two birds with one stone. Although the swordsman was unrestrained, most of the people here hadn't been to the origin world. They were very responsive. After all, if they went out in a group, they would have a veteran to lead them. They wouldn't lose their way. Some busybodies started to form alliances. Since they were all loners, they didn't reject the idea. Now, what they needed to discuss was how to get a floating raft that could pass through the spatial barrier. Although Banju and a few other true monarch swordsmen had such things, they were all single-person floating rafts and couldn't carry too many people. It was certain that after the news spread in the sword vein, there would be many more who wanted to join. Even a medium-sized floating raft might not be able to carry them, but how could they afford a large-scale spatial floating raft? Swordsmen's main characteristic was that they were poor. It was as if they didn't need anyone to teach them. They were all like this. While the group was in full swing, Banju and a few other swordsmen, true monarch swordsmen, sensed that something was wrong. After careful observation, a true monarch swordsman laughed. So it's a small beast tied. What's wrong? Are these immemorial beasts also coming here to compete with us swordsmen? That was one thing, but they couldn't fight against a group of immemorial beasts like they did against human monks. This was because it could cause a huge commotion in the entire continent. Swordsmen needed to be hot-blooded, but they couldn't lose their rationality in the face of such a situation. Banju called out to everyone. Forget it. We humans have been in this lawless place for more than 10 years. We can't just let the immemorial beasts show their presence here. Everyone, enter the Sword Pass Steel and let them pass. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.